Hello.
ಹಲೋ, ಇದೇನು ಉಲ್ಟಾ ಹಾಕೊಂಡಿದ್ದೆ ನಾನು. Okay. So good morning, all of you. We'll start with the first chapter. The name of the chapter is the historical background. Okay. So how many of you know about the Battle of Plassey, Battle of Buxar? Even though it is history, you can ask me how is it related to polity, but we have to know about it. Okay. Ili, Raichur. Huh? What happened in these two battles? So basically, we all have to know that in the 1600s itself, British East India Company, which is a private company, took the permission of the Queen there, came with a charter to India, and a kind of a license. They came to India, they started to trade in the coastal areas in Bombay, in Calcutta, Madras. So gradually they spread across the country. At one point of time, specifically which is 1757, which led to a battle which is considered to be a very decisive part in India's history. Yake? First time you have an Indian ruler being defeated by the British East India Company. Yenaitu illi in Calcutta, which was ruled by a person called as Siraj-ud-Dawla, who was the Nawab there. He was defeated by Robert Clive of East India Company. So adaitu, they started to rule over Calcutta. ಸೋತ್ ಮೇಲೆ ಲ್ಯಾಂಡ್ ಕೊಡಬೇಕಲ್ವಾ, ದೇ ಸ್ಟಾರ್ಟೆಡ್ ಟು ರೂಲ್ ಓವರ್ ದಿಸ್ ಏರಿಯಾ. ಸೊ ಸಿರಾಜುದ್ದೌಲಾನ ಸೋಲ್ಸಾಯಿತು. ಯು ನೋ ಹೌ ಹಿ ಲಾಸ್ಟ್, ರೈಟ್? ದೆರ್ ವರ್ 50,000 ಸೋಲ್ಜರ್ಸ್ ಆನ್ ಸಿರಾಜುದ್ದೌಲಾ, ಅರೌಂಡ್ 5,000 ಆನ್ ರಾಬರ್ಟ್ ಕ್ಲೈವ್. ಕಡೆ 5,000 ಜನನೂ ಇಲ್ಲ, ಈ ಕಡೆ 50,000 ಜನ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ. ಬಟ್ ಸ್ಟಿಲ್ ದೇ ಡಿಫೀಟೆಡ್ ಬಿಕಾಸ್ ಆಫ್ ಅ ಪರ್ಸನ್ ಕಾಲ್ಡ್ ಆಸ್ ಮೀರ್ ಜಾಫರ್. ಆಯ್ತಾ? ಸೊ ಮೀರ್ ಜಾಫರ್ ಆದಮೇಲೆ ಮೀರ್ ಕಾಸಿಮ್ became the Nawab of Bengal. Okay, so Mir Qasim is the Nawab of Bengal. There is one more person called as Shuja-ud-Dawla, who is the Nawab of Awadh, and the Mughal emperor is Shah Alam II. ಅರ್ಥ ಆಗ್ತಿದೆಯಾ? ಇಂಡಿಯಾ ಮ್ಯಾಪ್ ಒಂದ್ಸರಿ ಇಮ್ಯಾಜಿನ್ ಮಾಡಿ. ಡೆಲ್ಲಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಶಾ ಆಲಂ ಇದ್ದಾರೆ, ವಾಸ್ ಅ ಮುಘಲ್ ಎಂಪರರ್. ಅವಧ್ ಇಸ್ UP. ಆಯ್ತಾ? ದೇರ್ ಯು ಹ್ಯಾವ್ ಶುಜಾ-ಉದ್-ದೌಲಾ. ಅದ್ರ ಪಕ್ಕ ಬಿಹಾರ್ ಅಂಡ್ ಬೆಂಗಾಲ್, ವಿಚ್ ಇಸ್ ಅಂಡರ್ the control of Mir Jafar, Mir Qasim. So this is when the Battle of Buxar happens. So the Battle of Buxar alli you have Mir Qasim, Shuja-ud-Dawla, then a Mughal emperor Shah Alam. All of whom you will read it in detail in history, so I will not go in detail. All the three combined were defeated by the British East India Company. This is when they give the Diwani rights. Carefully observe, especially first chapter. ಈ ಫಸ್ಟ್ ಚಾಪ್ಟರ್ ಇಂದ ಒಂದು ಕ್ವಶನ್ ಬರ್ತಾನೆ ಇದೆ ಪ್ರಿಲಿಮ್ಸ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ. 1-2 ಕ್ವಶನ್ ಬರ್ತಾನೆ ಇರುತ್ತೆ. ಸೊ ಬಿ ಆಕ್ಟಿವ್. ಇದು ಈ ಟೈಮ್ ಲೈನ್ ನೀವು ಬಯಾಟ್ ಅನ್ನೋದಕ್ಕಿಂತ ಬಯಾಟ್ ಮಾಡಬೇಕು, ದರ್ ಇಸ್ ನೋ ಆಪ್ಷನ್. ಈ ಟೈಮ್ ಲೈನ್ ನೀವು ತಿಳ್ಕೊಂಡು ಹೊಟ್ಟೋದ್ರೆ ಯು ವಿಲ್ ನಾಟ್ ಹ್ಯಾವ್ ಎನಿ ಕನ್ಫ್ಯೂಷನ್. ಸೊ ವಾಟ್ ಇಸ್ ಹ್ಯಾಪನಿಂಗ್? ಬ್ಯಾಟಲ್ ಆಫ್ ಬಕ್ಸರ್. ಇದರಲ್ಲಿ ಬ್ರಿಟಿಷ್ ಈಸ್ಟ್ ಇಂಡಿಯಾ ಕಂಪನಿ ಇಸ್ ಡಿಫೀಟಿಂಗ್ ದ ನವಾಬ್ ಆಫ್ ಬೆಂಗಾಲ್, ನವಾಬ್ ಆಫ್ ಅವಧ್ ಅಂಡ್ ದ ಮುಘಲ್ ಎಂಪರರ್. ಆಯ್ತಾ? ಸೊ ದೇ ಗೇವ್ ದಿವಾನಿ ರೈಟ್ಸ್. ವಾಟ್ ಇಸ್ ದಿವಾನಿ ರೈಟ್ಸ್? Collecting land revenue. So which was under these Nawabs and the Mughal emperors. Now this power was transferred to the East India Company, which we call it as Diwani rights, of which all areas? Bengal, Bihar and Odisha. Very good. So the Diwani rights was given. But after this, from 1765 to 1773 is one of the worst phases in India's history. Yake? So when we mean by what we mean by historical background ಅಂತಂದ್ರೆ ಈ ನಮ್ಮ ಕಾನ್ಸ್ಟಿಟ್ಯೂಷನ್ನು ದ ಲಾಸ್ ಎಲ್ಲಿಂದ ಸ್ಟಾರ್ಟ್ ಆಯಿತು ಅಂತ ನಾವು ನೋಡ್ಕೊಂಬರ್ಬೇಕಾಯ್ತಾ. ಸೊ ದ್ಯಾಟ್ ಈಸ್ ವೈ ವಿ ಹ್ಯಾವ್ ಟು ನೋ ಆಲ್ ಆಫ್ ದೀಸ್ ಥಿಂಗ್ಸ್. ಸೊ 1765 to 1773 in India's administrative history is considered to be the worst period. ಯಾಕೆ? ಯಾಕೆ ಅಂದರೆ ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಸೋಲ್ಸೋದ್ರ ಇಂಡಿಯನ್ಸ್ನ. Now Robert Clive introduced something called as dual rule. Okay, dual government or dual rule. What is this dual or double government or dual government? What is it? Ibru yararadu? Diwani rights was carried out by British East India Company. One more, not administration, Nizamati rights. What is Diwani rights? Collection of tax, and also they administered civil justice. Civil justice and property disputes, and the criminal aspects were dealt by the local rulers. Even though the British East India Company had interference there also, but at least on the paper it was held that the Nizamati rights, Diwani rights was with East India Company, Nizamati rights with these local rulers. This period is considered to be very bad for the people also. ಯಾಕೆ? ಇವಾಗ ನೋಡಿ, ಇವಾಗ ಪೊಲೀಸ್ ಡಿಪಾರ್ಟ್ಮೆಂಟ್ ಒಂದಿಂದ್ರೇ ನಮಗೆ ತೊಂದರೆ ರೋಡಲ್ಲಿ ಹೋಗ್ತಾ. ಇಮ್ಯಾಜಿನ್ ಹ್ಯಾವಿಂಗ್ 2 ಡಿಪಾರ್ಟ್ಮೆಂಟ್ಸ್. ಫ್ಯೂಚರ್ ಆಫೀಸರ್ಸ್ ನೀವೇ, ಐಮ್ ಜಸ್ಟ್ ಕಿಡಿಂಗ್. ಓಕೆ, ಸೊ ಜಸ್ಟ್ ಇಮ್ಯಾಜಿನ್ ಡ್ಯೂಯಲ್ ರೆಗ್ಯುಲೇಷನ್ ಎಲ್ಲ ಕಡೆ. ಒಬ್ಬರು ಕಾಟ ಕೊಡೋದು ಸಾಲದೆ ಇನ್ನೊಬ್ಬನು ಕೊಡ್ತಾನೆ. ಸೊ ಇಟ್ ವಾಸ್ ಬ್ಯಾಡ್ ಫಾರ್ ಪೀಪಲ್ ಆಲ್ಸೋ. ಸೊ ಡ್ಯೂಯಲ್ ಗೌರ್ಮೆಂಟ್ ವಾಸ್ ನಾಟ್ ಗುಡ್. ಇಟ್ ವಾಸ್ ನಾಟ್ ಗುಡ್ ಫಾರ್ ದ ಈಸ್ಟ್ ಇಂಡಿಯಾ ಕಂಪನಿ ಆಲ್ಸೋ. ಸೊ ಏನಾಯಿತು ಇಂಡಿಯಾದಲ್ಲಿ? ಇಂಡಿಯಾ ಇನ್ ದ ಸೆನ್ಸ್ ದ ಪ್ರೆಸಿಡೆನ್ಸೀಸ್ ಆರ್ ಈ ಬ್ರಿಟಿಷ್ ಏರಿಯಾಸ್ ಎಲ್ಲೆಲ್ಲಿ ಆಕ್ಯುಪೈ ಮಾಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ ಆ ಜಾಗಗಳು ಮಾತ್ರ. ಓಕೆ, ವಾಸ್ ಮೈಸೂರು ಆಕ್ಯುಪೈಡ್ ಅಟ್ ದಿಸ್ ಪಾಯಿಂಟ್ ಆಫ್ ಟೈಮ್? ನೋ. ಹೂ ರೂಲ್ಡ್ ದೆನ್? ಮೈಸೂರು. ಹೂ ರೂಲ್ಡ್ ಮೈಸೂರು? ಅಂದರೆ ನಾವೆಲ್ಲ ಮೈಸೂರವರಲ್ವ ಇಲ್ಲಿ. ಮೈಸೂರು ಟುಡೇ ಇಟ್ ಇಸ್ ಕರ್ನಾಟಕ. ಸೊ ರಾಯಚೂರವರು ಹೈದರಾಬಾದ್ ಕರ್ನಾಟಕ. ದೇ ವರ್ ನಾಟ್ ಅಂಡರ್ ದ ಮೈಸೂರು ಕಿಂಗ್ಡಮ್. ಇಟ್ ವಾಸ್ ಹೈದರಾಲಿ and Tipu Sultan. Okay, later they were defeated in 1799 when Tipu Sultan died. Even Mysore went to British East India Company. Like this, there were many other provinces. The province that we are talking about is only Bengal, Bihar and Odisha, where East India Company is ruling. Okay, so now what is happening? And Bombay is with them, Madras is with them, and few other areas. So what is happening now? There is a huge crisis in the East India Company itself. ಇವ್ರು ಬಂದು ಎಷ್ಟು ವರ್ಷ ಆಯ್ತು ಇವಾಗ ಇಂಡಿಯಾಗೆ? ಇವಾಗ ಅಂದರೆ ನಾವು ವಿ ಆರ್ ಇನ್ 1765. 1764 ವಿ ಸಾ ದ ಟೈಮ್ ಲೈನ್. ನೋ, ವಿ ಆರ್ ಇನ್ ದಿಸ್ ಟೈಮ್ ಲೈನ್. ಈ ಡ್ಯೂಯಲ್ ಗೌರ್ಮೆಂಟ್ಲಿ ಇದ್ದೀವಿ ಅಂತ ಅನ್ಕೊಳ್ಳೋಣ. ಅವ್ರು ಬಂದು ಎಷ್ಟು ವರ್ಷ ಆಯಿತು? 150 ವರ್ಷ ಆಯ್ತಲ್ವಾ? ಸೊ ಬ್ರಿಟಿಷ್ ಈಸ್ಟ್ ಇಂಡಿಯಾ ಕಂಪನಿ ಇಸ್ ಆಲ್ರೆಡಿ 150, more than 150 years old. They are trading in India. Are they in profit? Are they in profit? Yes. How many say yes? How many say yes, sir? They're at loss. ಸೊ ನಾನು ಕೇಳ್ತಿರೋದು ಕಂಪನಿಗೆ, ಕ್ರೈಸಿಸ್ ಆಫ್ ಈಸ್ಟ್ ಇಂಡಿಯಾ ಕಂಪನಿ ಲಾಸಾ ಪ್ರಾಫಿಟಾ? ದೇ ವೇರ್ ಅಂಡರ್ ಸಿವಿಯರ್ ಲಾಸ್. ಯಾಕೆ? ಯು ಆರ್ ಟೆಲಿಂಗ್ ನೋ ದ ಅಫಿಷಿಯಲ್ಸ್ ಆಫ್ ದ ಈಸ್ಟ್ ಇಂಡಿಯಾ ಕಂಪನಿ were very corrupt. Okay, so that was one of the main reasons why East India Company became very corrupt. Will the British Parliament keep quiet looking at a company that is going at loss? Loss adru bejarilla. What they did is, the East India Company had taken loans from Bank of England. ನಾನು ಇನ್ ಡೀಟೇಲ್ಡ್ ಆಗಿ ಎಕ್ಸ್ಪ್ಲೇನ್ ಮಾಡ್ತೀನಿ. ನೋಟ್ಸ್ ಮಾತ್ರ ಪಾಯಿಂಟ್ಸ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ನಿಮಗೆ ಅಷ್ಟು ಮಾತ್ರ ಬರೆಸ್ತೀನಿ, ಬಿಕಾಸ್ ಯು ವಿಲ್ ಗೆಟ್ ದ ಬುಕ್. ಯಾಕೆಂದರೆ ಸುಮ್ಮನೆ ಟೈಮ್ ವೇಸ್ಟ್ ಆಗುತ್ತೆ, ಆಯಿತಾ? ಸೊ ಕರೆಕ್ಟಾಗಿ ಕೇಳಿಸ್ಕೊಂಬಿಡಿ. ಸೊ ಇದೆಲ್ಲ ನಾನು ಆಮೇಲೆ ಡಿಕ್ಟೇಟ್ ಮಾಡಲ್ಲ, ಅದಕ್ಕೆ ಐ ಆಮ್ ಟೆಲಿಂಗ್ ಯು ನೌ ಓನ್ಲಿ. ಓಕೆ, ಇಟ್ ಈಸ್ ದೇರ್ ಇನ್ ದ ಬುಕ್. ಸೊ ಬ್ಯಾಂಕ್ ಆಫ್ ಇಂಗ್ಲೆಂಡಿಂದ ದೇ ಹ್ಯಾಡ್ ಟೇಕನ್ loans. They were having huge debts. They were not paying it back also. They were not able to pay. So will the British Parliament or the British government keep quiet with respect to East India Company? Yes? Bunny. ಏನು ನಿಮ್ಮ ಹೆಸರೇನು? ಗಿರಿ. ಊರು? ಆಡುಗೋಡಿ, ಬೆಂಗಳೂರೇ. ಚರಣ್, ನೀವು ಆಡುಗೋಡಿನಾ? ಓಕೆ. ಎನಿವೇ, look at the board. So what is happening? East India Company is under loss. One is because you are telling that there is corruption and they had huge debts that they had taken from Bank of England, like Vijay Mallya or Nirav Modi or Lalit Modi. Why we are worried about them? ಬಿಡಿ, ಅವ್ರ ಕಂಪ್ನಿ ಲಾಸ್ ಆಯಿತು, ನಮ್ಗೇನಂತ ನಾವು ಸುಮ್ಮನಿಲ್ಲ. ಯಾಕೆ ಅಂತಂದರೆ ನಮ್ಮ ದುಡ್ಡು ಎತ್ಕೊಂಡು ಹೋಗಿರೋದು ಅವರು ಫ್ರಮ್ SBI, ಫ್ರಮ್ ಪಂಜಾಬ್ ನ್ಯಾಷನಲ್ ಬ್ಯಾಂಕ್. ವೆರಿ ಸಿಮಿಲರ್ಲಿ, ದಿಸ್ ಬ್ಯಾಂಕ್ ಇಸ್ ಆಫ್ ದಟ್ ಈಸ್ ಬಿಲಾಂಗಿಂಗ್ ಟು ಬ್ರಿಟಿಷ್ ಗೌರ್ಮೆಂಟ್. ಸೊ ಇವ್ರು ನಮಗೆ ಸಾಲ ವಾಪಸ್ ಕೊಡಬೇಕು. ದಟ್ ಈಸ್ ವೈ ವೆನ್ ದೇ ಥಾಟ್ ಫಾರ್ ದ ಫಸ್ಟ್ ಟೈಮ್ ಇನ್ 1773 that we should regulate this people. That is why in 1773 there was something called as Regulating Act that came. ಅರ್ಥ ಆಗ್ತಿದೆಯಾ? What you understood is here not the facts that I have told. Why the British Parliament started to control directly over India. See, until 1773, British Parliament has no role in India. British government has no role in India. Correct alva? It is only East India Company that they are doing. They have recruited people, they have a board. That's a different thing. British Parliament does not have anything here. It is because of the huge corruption that was there in the East India Company, and moreover the company was under loss and they had taken huge loans from Bank of England. That is when the government intervened. The factual thing, if you want to know, in what they were trading, what products were they trading in? East India Company ಯಾವ ವಸ್ತುಗಳನ್ನ ಯೂಸ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಿದ್ರು ಟ್ರೇಡ್ ಮಾಡೋದಕ್ಕೆ? ದೆನ್ ಓಕೆ, spices. So tea was one of the main aspects of trade. So why I am giving you this example is just to show how you ಎಷ್ಟು ಲಾಸ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಇದ್ರು ಅಂತ. They had factories and godowns, no? The tea which they were buying it from China, which they were buying it from Northeast, were all rotting in their godowns. ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಅವರೆಷ್ಟು ಕರಪ್ಟೆಡ್, ಎಷ್ಟು ಅಡ್ಮಿನಿಸ್ಟ್ರೇಟಿವ್ ಕ್ರೈಸಿಸ್ ಇತ್ತು ಅಂತ ಅಂದ್ರೆ they were not even able to sell it. So dead stock ಆಗಿ ಸುಮ್ಮನೆ ಬಿದ್ದಿದೆ. So this is when the East India Company was being regulated by the East India Company, and the first law in India that came was the Regulating Act. So who is regulating whom? Is regulating Aste. That is why it is called as Regulating Act. What are the provisions of the Regulating Act? ಹೇಳಿ, ಸುಮ್ಮನೆ ಗೆಸ್ ಮಾಡಿ, ತೊಂದರೆ ಇಲ್ಲ. What are the British Parliament trying to regulate of the company? The first thing they'll try to regulate is the economic aspects, right? Correct alva? So the first condition that was laid before the East India Company was, ನಿಮಗೆ ಎಷ್ಟೇ ಲಾಭ ಬರುತ್ತಲ್ಲ, the dividends that you get, ಅದ್ರಲ್ಲಿ 10% ಮಾತ್ರ ನೀವು ತಗೋಬೇಕು, ಇನ್ನು ಮಿಕ್ಕಿದ್ನೆಲ್ಲ ನೀವು ಸಾಲ ತೀರಿಸ್ಬೇಕು ಫಸ್ಟ್. That was the condition that is there here. But anyway, that's not required for us. You will read it in economy. But what is there in the Regulating Act is that for the first time there is something called as Court of Directors, that they are trying to introduce. Andre, you see the modern, administrative setup that we have. It is all developed, by this kind of either. And moreover, there was a governor who was there already in England. he became the Governor General of Bengal. Who was he? Warren Hastings became the first Governor General. Governor General was assisted by 4 members who were there in the Executive Council. What is this Executive Council? The same organs which you read. Legislature, Executive ನೀವು ಓದ್ತಿರಲ್ವಾ? Very similarly, in the later acts, when Legislative Council was created, that is how Indian legislature grew. This is the Executive Council that is there. You can, it is like a secretary. In modern day, you compare ಮಾಡ್ತೀರಾ ಅಂತಂದ್ರೆ, it is a under secretary or a governor. All these are executives. Okay, so this Governor General also had 4 Executive Council members. This was mentioned in the act. And for the first time, Supreme Court was set up at Calcutta. But that's not Calcutta, it is Fort Williams. Madras was called as Fort St. George. Okay, so through the Regulating Act, there was a Governor General that was appointed for Bengal. That was Warren Hastings. He had 4 Executive Council members. There was a Court of Directors that was created, and a Supreme Court was set up at Fort Williams, or it is Calcutta. And at last, there was a provision that was introduced saying that no bribes, for the officials. It was banned. It was mentioned in the act. And from now on, the East India Company had to be strictly regulated by the British Parliament. Okay, na? Can we write down historical background? ಇವತ್ತಾಯ್ತು ಎಲ್ರದ್ದು ಬ್ರೇಕ್ಫಾಸ್ಟು. ಸೊ ಟುಡೇ ಇಸ್ 8 to 10. ಹಾಂ, ನೀವು ಶೋರಾಗಿ ಹೇಳಿ. ಹಾಂ, ಓಕೆ. ಹಿಸ್ಟಾರಿಕಲ್ ಬ್ಯಾಕ್ಗ್ರೌಂಡ್, ಫಸ್ಟ್ ಚಾಪ್ಟರ್. ಏನು ಮೇಡಮ್ ಹೇಳಿ, ಪರವಾಗಿಲ್ಲ. ಆಗಿಲ್ವಾ? ಒಳ್ಳೇದಾಯ್ತು ಬಿಡಿ, ಉಪವಾಸ ಇರಬೇಕು. ಹಾಂ, ಇನ್ನೂ ಸಣ್ಣ ಆಗ್ತಾರೆ. ಬ್ರೇಕ್ಫಾಸ್ಟ್ ಅನ್ಕಂಬ ಇನ್ ದ PG ಮಾಡಿರಲ್ಲ. ಓಕೆ, ಎನಿವೆ you leave at 10, you can go early. Aita? Anyway, historical background. In the 1600, the EIC, the English East India Company, the EIC received a charter from Queen Elizabeth and started to trade in India. Aita? They started to trade in India. East India Company received charter from Queen Elizabeth I in 1600, started to trade in India. History, modern history ಯಾರು ಓದಿದ್ದೀರಾ? ಓದಿದ್ರೆ ಇದು ಕನೆಕ್ಟ್ ಆಗುತ್ತೆ. ಆಗಿದೆಯಾ? ನಿಮ್ಮ ಎಕ್ಸಾಮ್ಸ್ಗಂತೂ ಸ್ಪೆಷಲಿ ಹಿಸ್ಟ್ರಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಮಾಡರ್ನ್ ಹಿಸ್ಟ್ರಿ ಇಸ್ ವೆರಿ ಇಂಪಾರ್ಟೆಂಟು. ಏನ್ಷಿಯಂಟ್ ಮೆಡಿವಲ್ ಇಂಪಾರ್ಟೆಂಟ್ ಅಲ್ಲ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳ್ತಿಲ್ಲ, ಬಟ್ ಕಂಪ್ಯಾರಿಟಿವ್ಲಿ ಮಾಡರ್ನ್ ಹಿಸ್ಟ್ರಿ ಇಸ್ ವೆರಿ ವೆರಿ ಇಂಪಾರ್ಟೆಂಟ್. ಪಾಲಿಟಿ, ಜಿಯೋಗ್ರಫಿ ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ಇನ್ಯಾವುದು ಎಕನಾಮಿ. ದೀಸ್ 4 ಕೋರ್ ಸಬ್ಜೆಕ್ಟ್ಸ್ನು ಯು ಶುಡ್ ಬಿ ವೆರಿ ವೆಲ್ ವರ್ಸ್ಡ್. ಆಯಿತಾ? ಸೆಕೆಂಡ್ ಪಾಯಿಂಟ್, ಫುಲ್ ಎಕ್ಸ್ಪ್ಲನೇಷನ್ ಏನು ಹೇಳೋಕ್ಕೋಗಲ್ಲ. ಇನ್ 1765, ರೈಟ್ ಡೌನ್. In 1765, they got the what rights? Diwani rights. They, in the sense, East India Company. They got the Diwani rights of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. 1765 to 70, next point. 1765 to 1773. Dual government was introduced by Robert Clive. Dual government was introduced by Robert Clive. ಅಷ್ಟೇ. Now Regulating Act 1770. ಸಾಕಲ್ವ ಎಷ್ಟು ಪಾಯಿಂಟ್ಸ್ ನಿಮಗೆ ಫಾರ್ ನಿಮಗೆ ಜ್ಞಾಪಕ ಇಟ್ಕೊಳ್ಳೋಕ್ಕಿದೆ. What are the provisions of Regulating Act? ಮೇಡಮ್ ನಿಮ್ಮ ಹೆಸರು ಮರ್ತೋಯ್ತು, ಸುಷ್ಮಿತಾ ಹೇಳಿ. What are the provisions under Regulating Act? ಹಾಂ ಹೇಳಿ. Governor General was appointed, who is Warren Hastings. He was assisted by a Executive Council with 4 members. This was mentioned in the Act. Supreme Court was established. Then receiving gifts or bribes was abolished. Right? We'll write down. Court of Directors. Aita barkolli. First point. In Bengal, the governor of Bengal was designated as yaro? Governor General of Bengal. Governor General of Bengal. Bracket alli Warren Hastings became the first such Governor General. Second point. ಈ ಥರ ಮಾಡಿದ್ರೆ ನಿಮಗೆ ರಿವೈಸ್ ಮಾಡೋಕ್ಕೆ ಕಷ್ಟ ಆಗುತ್ತೆ. ವೆನ್ ಯು ಆರ್ ಮೇಕಿಂಗ್ ನೋಟ್ಸ್ನೋ ಆ ಥರ ಮಾಡಿ. ಕೇರ್ಲೆಸ್ ಆಗಿ ಬರ್ಕೋಬೇಡಿ ನೋಟ್ಸ್ನ. ಈ ಎಫರ್ಟ್ಸ್ ಹಾಕೋದನ್ನ ಕರೆಕ್ಟಾಗಿ ಹಾಕಿ. ನಾಳೆ ಎಕ್ಸಾಮ್ ಹತ್ರ ಬಂದಾಗ ಇದ್ರ ಇಂಪಾರ್ಟೆನ್ಸ್ ಗೊತ್ತಾಗುತ್ತೆ. ನೀವು ಕೇಳಿರ್ತೀರಲ್ವಾ ಕ್ಲಾಸಲ್ಲಿ, ಇದೆಲ್ಲ ಜ್ಞಾಪಕ ಆಗುತ್ತೆ ನೀವು ನೋಟ್ಸ್ ಓದಬೇಕಿದ್ರೆ. ಸೊ ವಾಟ್ ಯು ಡೂ, ಗ್ಯಾಪ್ ಬಿಟ್ಬಿಟ್ಟು ಆ ಪಾಯಿಂಟಲ್ಲಿ ಬರ್ಕೊಳ್ಳಿ. ಯಾಕೆ ಗೊತ್ತಾ, ಫ್ರಮ್ 1773 to 1947 ಎಷ್ಟು ಆ್ಯಕ್ಟ್ಸ್ ಇದೆ, ಎಲ್ಲ ಪ್ರಾವಿಷನ್ಸು ಜ್ಞಾಪಕ ಇರಬೇಕು. ಯು ಹ್ಯಾವ್ ಪಿಟ್ಸ್ ಆ್ಯಕ್ಟ್, ಚಾರ್ಟರ್ ಆ್ಯಕ್ಟ್, ಅದರಲ್ಲೇ 3. ನೆಕ್ಸ್ಟ್ ಇಂಡಿಯನ್ ಕೌನ್ಸಿಲ್ಸ್ ಆ್ಯಕ್ಟ್, ಅದರಲ್ಲಿ 3. ಗೌರ್ಮೆಂಟ್ ಆಫ್ ಇಂಡಿಯಾ ಆ್ಯಕ್ಟ್ 1919, 1935, ಇಂಡಿಪೆಂಡೆನ್ಸ್ ಆ್ಯಕ್ಟ್ 1947. ಇಷ್ಟು ನಿಮಗೆ ನಾನು ಬಹೆಟ್ ಮಾಡಿ ಅಂತ ಜನರಲ್ ಆಗಿ ಹೇಳ್ದೆ. ಬಟ್ ಈ ಚಾಪ್ಟರ್ ಅಂತೂ ಯು ಶುಡ್ ನೋ ಎವ್ರಿಥಿಂಗ್ ಫ್ರಮ್ ರೆಗ್ಯುಲೇಟಿಂಗ್ ಆ್ಯಕ್ಟ್ ಟು ಇಂಡಿಯನ್ ಇಂಡಿಪೆಂಡೆನ್ಸ್ ಆ್ಯಕ್ಟ್ ಆಫ್ 1947. ಇಲ್ಲಿವರೆಗೂ ಎಲ್ಲ ಗೊತ್ತಿರಬೇಕು. ಓಕೆನಾ? ಸೊ ಕನ್ಫ್ಯೂಸ್ ಆಗುತ್ತೆ. ಚಾರ್ಟರ್ ಆ್ಯಕ್ಟಲ್ಲಿ ಇದಿತ್ತಾ, ಇದರಲ್ಲಿತ್ತಾ, ಪಿಟ್ಸ್ ಇಂಡಿಯಾ ಆ್ಯಕ್ಟಲ್ಲಿತ್ತಾ, ಸೆಟಲ್ಮೆಂಟ್ ಆ್ಯಕ್ಟಲ್ಲಿತ್ತಾ, ಯಾವ ಆ್ಯಕ್ಟಲ್ಲಿ ಯಾವ ಪ್ರಾವಿಷನ್ ಅನ್ನೋದು ಮರ್ತೋಗುತ್ತೆ. ಸೊ ಗ್ಯಾಪ್ ಬಿಡಿ, ಆ ಪಾಯಿಂಟ್ಸ್ ಬರ್ಕೊಳ್ಳಿ. ಕಮ್ ನೆಕ್ಸ್ಟ್ ಪಾಯಿಂಟ್, ಅಂಡರ್ಲೈನ್ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಳ್ಳಿ ಹೆಡ್ಡಿಂಗ್ನ. ರೆಗ್ಯುಲೇಟಿಂಗ್ ಆ್ಯಕ್ಟ್, ಪಿಟ್ಸ್ ಇಂಡಿಯಾ ಆ್ಯಕ್ಟ್, ಚಾರ್ಟರ್ ಆ್ಯಕ್ಟ್. ಓಕೆ, ಆ ಗ್ಯಾಪ್ ಬಿಟ್ಟು ನೀಟಾಗಿ ಬರ್ಕೊಳ್ಳಿ. ಇಫ್ ಯು ಹ್ಯಾವ್ ರೆಡ್ ಪೆನ್ ಯು ಕ್ಯಾನ್ ರೈಟ್ ದ ಟೈಟಲ್, ಆರ್ ಬ್ಲ್ಯಾಕ್ ಪೆನ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಅಂಡರ್ಲೈನ್, ಸಮಥಿಂಗ್ ಡೂ ಲೈಕ್ ದಟ್. ಆಯಿತಾ? ವಾಟ್ ಇಸ್ ಸೆಕೆಂಡ್ ಪಾಯಿಂಟ್? ಸಾರಿ, no, did you write that it provided for establishment of a Supreme Court? It provided for the establishment of a Supreme Court in Calcutta. Next point, prohibited the servants from, servants andre officials, the servants of the company from. So today you are called as civil servants, no? Same way, the servants of the company from receiving gifts or bribes. From receiving gifts or bribes. Last point, it created Court of Directors to report on the revenue, civil and military affairs in India. Revenue, civil and military affairs in India. Okay, so we'll go. So now they regulated the company through something called as Regulating Act. But still there were some issues. So in between, in 1781, there was something called as Settlement Act that came. Don't write, I'll dictate. Settlement Act that came in between. This tried to resolve some issues. But after it, in 1784, Pitt's India Act was passed. ಎಲ್ಲನೂ ಒಂದು 10 ಆಕ್ಟ್ ಇದೆ ಅಷ್ಟೇ, ಚೆನ್ನಾಗಿ ನೆನಪು ಇಟ್ಕೊಳ್ಳಿ. Pitt's India Act was passed. What is the significance of the Pitt's India Act? There is something called as Court of Directors that is created, no? What is their role? To report on what is happening. Illi anta. They have to report it to whom? To the British Parliament. Now, along with the Court of Directors, something called as Board of Control was created. This Board of Control had to report on the political affairs in India. See, what is happening in 1784 ಅಂತ ಅಂದರೆ, ನೀವು ಇಂಡಿಯನ್ ಮ್ಯಾಪ್, ಸಿ ದಿಸ್ ಇಸ್ ನಾಟ್ ಹಿಸ್ಟ್ರಿ ಕ್ಲಾಸ್, ಬಟ್ ಸ್ಟಿಲ್ ಯಾಕೆ ಇದೆಲ್ಲ ನಡೀತಿದೆ ಅಂತ ನಿಮ್ಗೆ ಅರ್ಥ ಆಗಬೇಕಲ್ಲ, ಅದಕ್ಕೆ ಹೇಳ್ತಿದ್ದೀನಿ. 1784 ಏನಾಗ್ತಿದೆ ಅಂತ ನೀವು ಅಬ್ಸರ್ವ್ ಮಾಡಿ. ದೇ ಆರ್ ಗ್ರ್ಯಾಜುಲಿ ಎಕ್ಸ್ಪ್ಯಾಂಡಿಂಗ್. 1784 ಆಲ್ರೆಡಿ ಆಂಗ್ಲೋ ಮರಾಠ ವಾರ್ ಸ್ಟಾರ್ಟ್ ಆಗಿದೆ ವಿತ್ ಹೈದರಾಲಿ. ಆಲ್ರೆಡಿ ನಿಜಾಮ್ಸ್ ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ English and the Nizams are fighting. The Marathas and the English are struggling with each other. So, don't you think there should be a body, think it in a British perspective, that there should be a body to regulate this company and to report what they are doing. Why? If they lose here, tomorrow the British dream of ruling India will be spoiled. See, they came as traders, no doubt about it. See, gradually how they are sweeping into the administrative thing silently. That is what we are studying now, that's all, okay? So, ಏನಾಗ್ತಿದೆ ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಅಂತಂದರೆ, ನಾವು ಕಂಪ್ನಿ ಮೇಲೆ ಒಂದು ಗ್ರಿಪ್ ತಗೋಬೇಕು. ಅವರು ಕಂಪ್ನಿ ಮೇಲೆ ಯಾಕೆ ಗ್ರಿಪ್ ತಗೋಬೇಕು? ಇಟ್ ಇಸ್ ಬಿಕಾಸ್ ದೇ ಡೋಂಟ್ ವಾಂಟ್ ಟು ಲೂಸ್ ಪೊಲಿಟಿಕಲ್ ಹೋಲ್ಡ್ ಓವರ್ ದಿಸ್ ಲ್ಯಾಂಡ್. ಯಾಕೆ? ದೇರ್ ಮೇಜರ್ ರೆವೆನ್ಯೂಸ್ ಇಂಡಿಯಾ. ಮೇಜರ್ ಅಲ್ಲ, 90% I will just tell you. At one point of time in 1800s, 60% of the imports to Britain from Asia was only coming not from India, only Bengal. One state, Bengal is big, and it includes Bangladesh also today. Bangladesh. ಈ ಒಂದು ಪ್ರಾವಿನ್ಸ್ ಇಂದ 60% of the imports were going to Britain. You can understand the importance of this land for the British. ಇಲ್ಲಷ್ಟು ಸಂಪತ್ತಿದೆ, ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ ಬೇಕೇ ಬೇಕು at any cost. Okay, the other European powers who came, no, they could not tolerate the British hegemony. ಅದಾದ್ಮೇಲೆ they went to Brazil, they went to South America, some went to North America. They went there. British concentration was completely on this land mass. Okay, ಅರ್ಥ ಆಗ್ತಿದೆಯಾ? So, they are creating something called as Board of Control who should report on political affairs. Okay, and Pitt's India Act is known for using the word British possessions in India. ನೀವು ಕೋರ್ಟ್ಗೆ ಹೋದ್ರೆ ಇವತ್ತು ಇದು ನಿಮ್ಮ ಪೊಸೆಷನಲ್ಲಿ ಇದೆಯಾ? ಪ್ರಾಪರ್ಟಿ ಡಿಸ್ಪ್ಯೂಟ್ಸ್ ನೀವೇನೋ ಸಿವಿಲ್ ಕೋರ್ಟ್ಗೆ ಹೋದ್ರೆ ನಿಮ್ಮ ಪೊಸೆಷನಲ್ಲಿ ಇದೆಯಾ ಅಂದ್ರೇನು? ಆ ಲ್ಯಾಂಡ್ ನಿಮ್ದಾ ಅಂತ. ಆ ಲ್ಯಾಂಡ್ ನಿಮ್ಮದು, ನೀವಲ್ಲಿ ಸ್ಟೇ ಮಾಡ್ತಿದ್ದೀರಾ ಅಂತ ಅರ್ಥ. ಸೊ the importance of Pitt's India Act lays in the fact that it mentioned the British territories in India as British possessions in India. Okay, so one more loophole of Pitt's India Act is it also created a kind of dual government. ಯಾವ್ದು? Board of Control and Court of Directors. So again, a confusion that was created in the East India Company, and they used the word British possessions in India. So from now on, East India Company, which was a trading company from 1600s, became almost a administrative company in India, or administrative unit in India, through which act? Pitt's India Act of 1784. Quickly, ಟಕ್ ಅಂತ ಎಲ್ಲ ಬರ್ಕೊಂಡು ಹೋಗ್ಬೇಕು, ಪಾಯಿಂಟ್ಸ್ ಅಷ್ಟೆ. Pitt's India Act of 1784. So I'm sorry, Bhumika answered British government regulating AAC. Very good. I'll look at your replies. I'm sorry. Pitt's India Act of 1784. Write down. Settlement Act was introduced in 1781. Was introduced as an amendment to rectify the mistakes, as an amendment to rectify the mistakes in regulating act. Okay, now we'll write about Pitt's India Act. Next point. Under the Pitt's India Act, a new office was created known as Board of Control. ಆಯ್ತಾ? ಬ್ರಾಕೆಟ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಟು ರಿಪೋರ್ಟ್ ಆನ್ ಪೊಲಿಟಿಕಲ್ ಅಫೇರ್ಸ್. ಆಯ್ತಾ? ನೀವು ರೆಗ್ಯುಲೇಟಿಂಗ್ ಆಕ್ಟ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಕೋರ್ಟ್ ಆಫ್ ಡೈರೆಕ್ಟರ್ಸ್ ಪೊಲಿಟಿಕಲ್ ಅಫೇರ್ಸ್ ನ ರಿಪೋರ್ಟ್ ಮಾಡಬೇಕಿತ್ತ? ನೋ. ಓನ್ಲಿ ಸಿವಿಲ್, ಮಿಲಿಟರಿ, and revenue affairs they had to report on. Now political affairs they had to report about it. The significance of this act is the British territory in India. The British territory in India was called as British possessions in India. British possessions in India. Aita. So this is Pitt's India Act. So we'll have a test on Saturday or Sunday. When? Sunday. Saturday. Okay. So what is this Charter Act? ಏನು ಮೇಡಮ್, ಏನು ಡೌಟ್ಸಾ? ಮತ್ತೆ ಟೆಸ್ಟ್ ಬರೆಯಲ್ಲ ಅಂತ ಮಾತಾಡ್ತಿದ್ದೀರಾ? ಹಾಂ, ಇಷ್ಟಕ್ಕೆ ಮಾಡ್ಬೋದಲ್ಲ ಒಂದು ಟೆಸ್ಟ್? ಓಕೆ, ವಿಲ್ ಹ್ಯಾವ್ ಅ ಟೆಸ್ಟ್. ಓಕೆ, ವಾಟ್ ಇಸ್ ಅ ಚಾರ್ಟರ್ ಆ್ಯಕ್ಟ್? ನಂಗೇನು ಗೊತ್ತಾ, ನೀವು ಮಾತಾಡ್ತಿದ್ರೆ ನಾನು ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಮಾಡಬೇಕಿದ್ರೆ ಏನು ಮಾತಾಡ್ತಿದ್ದಾರೆ ಇವರು, ಏನೋ ಡೌಟ್ಸ್ ಇದೆಯಾ ಅಂತ ನನಗೆ ಇದು ಕನ್ಫ್ಯೂಸ್ ಆಗುತ್ತೆ. ಓಕೆ, ನನ್ನ ಹತ್ರ ಹೆಂಗೆ ಗೊತ್ತಾ, ಯು ಶುಡ್ ಬಿ ವೆರಿ ವೆರಿ ಇಂಟರಾಕ್ಟಿವ್. ಈ ಕ್ಲಾಸಲ್ಲಿ ಅದೇ, ಎಸ್ಪೆಷಲಿ ಪಾಲಿಟಿ, ಇಫ್ ಯು ಡೋಂಟ್ ಇಂಟರಾಕ್ಟ್, ನೋ ಮಜಾನೇ ಇರಲ್ಲ. ಯು ಕಾಂಟ್ ಅಂಡರ್ಸ್ಟ್ಯಾಂಡ್ ಎನಿಥಿಂಗ್ ಆಲ್ಸೋ. ಓಕೆ, ಸೊ ಯು ಇಂಟರಾಕ್ಟ್ ಆಸ್ ಮಚ್ ಆಸ್ ಪಾಸಿಬಲ್. ಓಕೆ, ವಾಟ್ ಇಸ್ ಅ ಚಾರ್ಟರ್ ಆ್ಯಕ್ಟ್? ವಾಟ್ ಇಸ್ ಅ ಚಾರ್ಟರ್ ಬೇಸಿಕಲಿ? ನಾನು ನಿಮ್ಗೆ ಹೇಳಿದೆ 1600s ದ ಬ್ರಿಟಿಷ್ ಈಸ್ಟ್ ಇಂಡಿಯಾ ಕಂಪನಿ ರಿಸೀವ್ಡ್ ಅ ಚಾರ್ಟರ್ ಅಂತ ವಿ ರೋಟ್ ಅನ್ಸುತ್ತೆ ಫ್ರಮ್ ದ ಕ್ವೀನ್ ಎಲಿಜಬೆತ್. ಸೊ ದೆನ್ ವಾಟ್ ಯು ಮೀನ್ ಬೈ ಅ ಚಾರ್ಟರ್? ರೂಲ್ಸ್. ಓಕೆ, ಇಟ್ಸ್ ನಾಟ್ ಅ ಸೆಟ್ ಆಫ್ ರೂಲ್ಸ್. I told you, it is kind of a license, or it is, a renewal thing. You have a charter to trade here for 10 years, for 20 years, for 50 years. The charter that was issued in 1600s was forever. ಅಂದರೆ ಅದಕ್ಕೆ ನೀವೇನು ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಬರೆದಿಲ್ಲ, ಅದರಲ್ಲೇನು ಟೈಮ್ ಲೈನ್ ಮೆನ್ಷನ್ ಆಗಿಲ್ಲ, ತೊಗೊಂಡೋಗಿ ಮಾಡಿ ಟೈಮ್ ಲೈನ್ ಇರಲಿಲ್ಲ. ಬಟ್ ನಾವು 1793 there was one charter act that was introduced, not necessary for us, you will read in history, but 1813 charter act is important for us. Why? What is there in this? So basically ನಾವೇನು ನೋಡ್ತಿದ್ದೀವಿ ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಅಂತಂದರೆ, the East India Company which came as a trading company, ಇದು ಹೆಂಗೆ is becoming a administrative unit, or how British government is coming here ಅಂತ. ಈ ಆಪ್ತಮಿತ್ರ ಫಿಲಮಲ್ಲಿ ಹೇಗೆ ನಾಗವಲ್ಲಿಯಾಗಿ ಬದಲಾಗ್ತಿದ್ದಾಳೆ ನೋಡು ಅಂತಾರಲ್ಲ, ಆ ಥರ this trading company is turning into a political unit in India, a administrative unit in India. So in the Charter Act of 1813, the East India Company that was enjoying monopoly of trade with India. Monopoly of trade ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಏನು? East India Company is not a complete representatives of Britain. ಅರ್ಥ ಆಗ್ತಿದ್ಯಾ? ವಾಟ್ ಈಸ್ ಹ್ಯಾಪನಿಂಗ್ ಇನ್ ಬ್ರಿಟನ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಏನು ನಡೀತಿದೆ ಇವಾಗ? 1700s ಇಂದ 1800s ವರೆಗೂ ಇಂಡಸ್ಟ್ರಿಯಲ್ ರೆವಲ್ಯೂಷನ್ ಆಗ್ತಿದೆ. ತುಂಬ ಫ್ಯಾಕ್ಟ್ರೀಸ್ ದೇ ಆರ್ ಸೆಟ್ಟಿಂಗ್ ಅಪ್. ನಾವೆಲ್ಲ ಇನ್ನೂ ಎಲ್ಲಿದ್ದೀವಿ? ನಾವು ಒಂದೊಂದೇ ಬಟ್ಟೆ ಹೊಲ್ಕೊಂಡು ವೀವಿಂಗ್ ಮಿಷಿನಲ್ಲಿ ಮಾಡ್ತಿದ್ದೀವಿ. ನಾವು ಒಂದು ಬಟ್ಟೆ ತಯಾರಿಸಿದ್ರೆ ಅವರು 100 ಮಾಡ್ತಾರೆ. ಸೊ ಇಂಡಿಯಾ, ಆಫ್ರಿಕಾ ಆರ್ ಚೈನಾ ಆರ್ ಯುರೋಪ್ ಆರ್ ಎಲ್ಲೇ ಆದ್ರೂ, ವಿಲ್ ಯು ಬೈ ಅ ಪ್ರಾಡಕ್ಟ್ ವಿಚ್ ಇಸ್ ಚೀಪರ್ ಆರ್ ಕಾಸ್ಟ್ಲಿಯರ್? ಜನರಲಿ ಇವಾಗ ನಮ್ಮ ಫೋನು ಇಂದ ಹಿಡಿದು ಎಲ್ಲ, ಈ ಮೈಕಿಂದ ಹಿಡಿದು ಎಲ್ಲನೂ ಇಟ್ ಇಸ್ ಚೈನೀಸ್. ವೈ ಡು ವಿ ಬೈ ದಿಸ್? ಇಸ್ ಬಿಕಾಸ್ ಇಟ್ ಇಸ್ ಚೀಪ್. Okay, I will give you an option of buying an Indian mic which is 10,000 rupees and a Chinese mic which is 1,000 rupees. Which product will you buy? ನಿಜ ಹೇಳಿ, ಯಾವ ಚೀಪು ಅದೇ. ಸೊ ನಿಮ್ಮಷ್ಟು ದುಡ್ಡು ನಮ್ಮ ಹತ್ರ ಇಲ್ಲ. ವಿ ವಿಲ್ ಬೈ ಅ ಚೀಪರ್ ಪ್ರಾಡಕ್ಟ್ ಓನ್ಲಿ. ಸೊ ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಇಂಡಸ್ಟ್ರಿಯಲ್ ರೆವಲ್ಯೂಷನ್ ನಡೀತಿದೆ. ಎಲ್ಲಿ? ಇಂಗ್ಲೆಂಡಲ್ಲಿ. ದೇ ಆರ್ ಪ್ರೊಡ್ಯೂಸಿಂಗ್ ಮೋರ್ ಅಂಡ್ ಮೋರ್ ಪ್ರಾಡಕ್ಟ್ಸ್. ದೇ ಆರ್ ಸೆಲ್ಲಿಂಗ್ ಇಟ್ ಇನ್ ದ ಕಾಲನೀಸ್. ವಿ ಆರ್ ದ ಕಾಲನೀಸ್. ದೇ ಆರ್ ಸೆಲ್ಲಿಂಗ್ ಇಟ್ ಹಿಯರ್. ಅಂಥದ್ರಲ್ಲಿ ಈಸ್ಟ್ ಇಂಡಿಯಾ ಕಂಪನಿ ಒಂದೇ ಒಂದು ಕಂಪನಿ ಇಸ್ ನಾಟ್ ಅ ರೆಪ್ರೆಸೆಂಟೇಟಿವ್ ಆಫ್ ಎಂಟೈರ್ ಬ್ರಿಟನ್. ದೇ ಆರ್ ಒನ್ ಕಂಪನಿ ಹೂ ಹ್ಯಾವ್ ಕಮ್. There are other business people there. Even they want to make money. Even they want to trade. So when I mean that Charter Act of 1813 is taking away the monopoly of trade with India, it means other companies were also allowed on top, like East India Company. Why this is important to us? So 1813 Act ನೀವು ಹೆಂಗೆ ಜ್ಞಾಪಕ ಇಟ್ಕೊಳ್ಳಿ ಅಂದರೆ, ಇಟ್ಸ್ ಅ ಎಂಟ್ರಿ ಆ್ಯಕ್ಟ್ ಅಂತ ಜ್ಞಾಪಕ ಇಟ್ಕೊಳ್ಳಿ. ಅಂದರೆ ಇಂಡಿಯಾಗೆ ಅಪಾರ್ಟ್ ಫ್ರಮ್ ಈಸ್ಟ್ ಇಂಡಿಯಾ ಕಂಪನಿ, ಅದರ್ಸ್ ವೇರ್ ಆಲ್ಸೋ ಅಲೌಡ್ ಟು ಟ್ರೇಡ್ ಇನ್ ಇಂಡಿಯಾ. ಅಂದರೆ ಅದರ್ ಬ್ರಿಟಿಷ್ ಸಿಟಿಸನ್ಸ್ could also trade freely in India. But still, East India Company held the monopoly of trade with China and tea. ಈ ಟೀ ಅನ್ನೋ ಒಂದು ಪ್ರಾಡಕ್ಟಿಗೆ ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ ಮಾತ್ರ ಮೊನೊಪೊಲಿ ಇತ್ತು. ಅಂದರೆ ನೀವು ಬ್ರಿಟನ್ಗೆ ಹೋದರೆ ಇಂಡಿಯಾದಿಂದ ಟೀ ತರಿಸ್ತೀಯ ಅಂತ ಅಂದರೆ ಈಸ್ಟ್ ಇಂಡಿಯಾ ಕಂಪ್ನಿದು ಮಾತ್ರ ತಗೊಳ್ಳೋದಲ್ಲಿ, ಬೇರೆಯವ್ರನ್ನ ಅಲೌ ಮಾಡಲ್ಲ. ಸೊ ದೇ ರಿಟೈನ್ಡ್ ಇಟ್. ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ಆಲ್ಸೋ ದ ಬ್ರಿಟಿಷ್ ಪಾರ್ಲಿಮೆಂಟ್ ಅಲೌಡ್ ಕ್ರಿಶ್ಚಿಯನ್ ಮಿಷನರೀಸ್ ಟು ಕಮ್ ಟು ಇಂಡಿಯಾ. And remember, Britain and Christianity or religion is not at all important, because British were very clear. They were not worried about religion. They were not worried about conversions and all of these things. It was the Portuguese, the Danish, and the Denmark people who came from there, the Dutch. They were worried about religion. French and Britain, money and political power. So Christian missionaries were allowed, and East India Company had to keep away 1 lakh rupees to promote literature, to promote science, to promote education in India. So Charter Act of 1813 is, East India Company na onthara dummy ಮಾಡ್ತಿದ್ದಾರೆ ಅವರು. So they are making it as a dummy entity, and they are saying you don't have a monopoly of trade in India, you are not the only person. ಯಾಕೆ ಇದಾಗ್ತಿದೆ ಅಂದರೆ, ಐ ಟೋಲ್ಡ್ ಇಂಡಸ್ಟ್ರಿಯಲ್ ರೆವಲ್ಯೂಷನ್ ಆಯಿತು, ಅವ್ರು ಚೆನ್ನಾಗಿ ಗ್ರೋ ಆಗಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಅದು ಬಿಟ್ಟು ನೆಪೋಲಿಯನ್ ಹ್ಯಾಸ್ ಕಾಸ್ಡ್ ಅ ಗ್ರೇಟ್ ಡ್ಯಾಮೇಜ್. Napoleon Bonaparte, you have heard about him, no? In France, he created something called as continental system. Anyway, ಅದೆಲ್ಲ ತೀರಾ ನಿಮಗೆ ಬೇಕಾಗಿಲ್ಲ. ಅದೆಲ್ಲ ಆಗಿದ್ದಕ್ಕೆ they had to make changes there. And ಇದೆಲ್ಲದಕ್ಕಿಂತ ಇಂಪಾರ್ಟೆಂಟ್ ಏನು ಅಂತ ಅಂದರೆ, they are giving a deadline of 20 years. ಮೊನೊಪೊಲಿ ತೆಗೆದ್ರಲ್ವಾ, ಚೈನಾ ಮತ್ತು ಟೀಯಲ್ಲಿ ನೀವು ಮಾರ್ಕೊಡಿ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿದ್ರಲ್ವಾ, ಅದಕ್ಕೆ 20 ವರ್ಷ ಅಷ್ಟೇ. ಫಾರ್ ದ ನೆಕ್ಸ್ಟ್ 20 years until 1833 ನೀವು ಟ್ರೇಡ್ ಮಾಡಿ. ಆಫ್ಟರ್ ದಟ್ ಯು ಹ್ಯಾವ್ ಟು ಕಮ್ ಬ್ಯಾಕ್ ಟು ದ ಬ್ರಿಟಿಷ್, ಐ ಮೀನ್ ದ ಬ್ರಿಟಿಷ್ ಗೌರ್ಮೆಂಟ್, ಗೆಟ್ ಇಟ್ ರಿನ್ಯೂಡ್. ಆಮೇಲೆ 10 ವರ್ಷಕ್ಕೆ ಮಾಡ್ತೀರಿ, 20 ವರ್ಷಕ್ಕೆ ಮಾಡ್ತೀವೋ, ವಿ ವಿಲ್ ಗಿವ್ ಯು ಒನ್ ಮೋರ್ ಚಾರ್ಟರ್. ಸೊ ಬೇಸಿಕಲಿ ಆಫ್ಟರ್ 1813 ಟು ನೆಕ್ಸ್ಟ್ 20 years, is only their timeline. After 1833, they have to get it renewed. They have to get the license renewed, which is we calling it as the Charter. Aita? Charter Act of 1813. Charter Act 1813. Aita? You have a nice quote there. Best dreams are, will come when you are awake anta ಇದೆ. ಚೆನ್ನಾಗಿದೆ. There's a board here. Anyway, write down Charter Act 1813. ನೀವಿಬ್ರು ಏನೋ ಒಂದು ಮಾತಾಡ್ತಿರ್ತೀರಲ್ವ? Anyway, write down. ಅದಕ್ಕೆ ನಿಮ್ಮ ಸವಾಸ ಬೇಡ ಅಂತ ಸುಷ್ಮಿತಾ ಸಪ್ರೇಟ್ ಆಗಿ ಕೂತಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಕರೆಕ್ಟ್ ಅಲ್ವಾ? Anyway, write down Charter Act 1813. This was a renewal of the previous charter. Second point, the company was deprived of what? Monopoly of trade with India. But they could continue their trade in tea and with China. But with tea and China anta baradru saaku. ಸಿದ್ದು ತಿಂಡಿ ಆಯ್ತಾ? Next point, the Charter Act, or this Charter Act, made the company to continue for 20 more years. Also, the constitutional positions were mentioned for the first time. Okay. So, ಎಷ್ಟು ವರ್ಷ? 20 years. So again, there should be a renewal. So one more act was introduced, which is, so if someone asks you, why 1793, 1813, 1833, 1853 ಎಲ್ಲ 20 years ಗ್ಯಾಪ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಏನಕ್ಕೆ ಇದೆ ಅಂತಂದ್ರೆ, ಬಿಕಾಸ್ ಚಾರ್ಟರ್ ಕೊಟ್ಟಾಗೆಲ್ಲ 20 ವರ್ಷಕ್ಕೆ ಮಾತ್ರ ರಿನ್ಯೂ ಮಾಡ್ತಿದ್ರು. ಓಕೆನಾ? ಸೊ ಚಾರ್ಟರ್ ಆಕ್ಟ್ ಆಫ್ 1833, ವೆರಿ ವೆರಿ ಇಂಪಾರ್ಟೆಂಟ್ with respect to Indian history. Okay, na? All of you look at the board. Which kind of a rule do you like? A centralized power or a decentralized power? Why? For example, today the debate that is happening in India is South India should get more tax. South India should get more powers. Everything is centralized. But still, why are you supporting centralization? ಕರೆಕ್ಟ್ ಅಲ್ವಾ? ದ ಡಿಬೇಟ್ ಇವತ್ತು ನಡೀತಿರೋದು ಅದು ತಾನೆ. ಲ್ಯಾಂಗ್ವೇಜ್ ಬರೋಂಗಿಲ್ಲ, ಹಿಂದಿ ಬೇಡ, ನೆಕ್ಸ್ಟ್ ಫೈನಾನ್ಸ್ ಕಮಿಷನ್ ನಮಗೆ ಜಾಸ್ತಿ ದುಡ್ಡು ಬರಬೇಕು ಅನ್ನೋದೇ ಡಿಬೇಟ್ ನಡೀತಿರೋದು. ದೆನ್ ವೈ ಆರ್ ಯು ಸೇಯಿಂಗ್ ದಟ್ ದೇರ್ ಶುಡ್ ಬಿ ಸೆಂಟ್ರಲೈಸೇಷನ್ ಆಫ್ ಪವರ್? What is the reason? So we will see where this tendency of centralization in India that came to us. See, whatever we are today, isn't it a colonial output? I am wearing a shirt and a pant. Where my ancestors living in 1700s were wearing it? No. ಯಾರೋ ಒಬ್ಬ ಹಳ್ಳಿಲಿ ಇಂಗ್ಲೀಷ್ ಬರಲ್ಲ ಅಂದರೆ ಅವನು ದಡ್ಡ ಅಂತೀರಾ, ಬಟ್ ನಿಮ್ಗಿಂತ ಬುದ್ಧಿವಂತರ ಇರ್ತಾನೆ ಅವನು. ಹಿ ವುಡ್ ಹ್ಯಾವ್ ಹಿ ಈಸ್ ಎ ಫಾರ್ಮರ್, ಹಿ ನೋಸ್ ಹೌ ಟು ಡೂ ಅಗ್ರಿಕಲ್ಚರ್. ಒಬ್ಬಂಗೆ ಇಂಗ್ಲೀಷ್ ಬರಲ್ಲ ಅಂದರೆ ಅವ್ನು ದಡ್ಡ. ಒಬ್ಬ ಈ ಥರ ಬಿಹೇವ್ ಮಾಡಿಲ್ಲ ಅಂದರೆ ಯು ಆರ್ ಸ್ಟಿಲ್ ಇನ್ ದ ಕೊಲೋನಿಯಲ್ ಹ್ಯಾಂಗ್ ಓವರ್, ರೈಟ್? With respect to our constitution, our administration, our judiciary, we are still in that, there is an influence of at least a colonial thing that is there. Ivattu kuda, especially judiciary antu nimge innu chennagi eddu kaansutte. You call them as a lord. Idella, the practices, it is still evident. Okay. So, the centralization where we see is through, one of the key aspects is through the Charter Act of 1813. Yeah. It is not easy. How can a person sitting in Delhi control my village in Mysore? Same ಇರಬೇಕು, ಬಟ್ ಪವರ್ಸ್ ಇವ್ರಿಗೆ ತಾನೇ ಕೊಡಬೇಕು. ಇಟ್ ಶುಡ್ ಬಿ ಡಿಸೆಂಟ್ರಲೈಸ್ಡ್. See, for example, Karnataka should be allowed to collect taxes, or Tamil Nadu should be allowed to govern panchayats, to build hospitals. Correct alva? Or to build roads. That's your opinion. That is actually true. But anyway, we'll see, in the next, until 1947, what are the things that is happening. Yesterday we spoke about, did we talk about Sri Lanka yesterday? Now, Africa ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಒಂದು ಎಕ್ಸಾಂಪಲ್ ಕೊಟ್ಟೆ ಅಷ್ಟೇ. ಸೊ ಇಫ್ ಯು ಆರ್ ರೀಡಿಂಗ್ ಕಂಪ್ಲೀಟ್ NCERTs ಫುಲ್ಲಿ ಓದಿದ್ರೆ ನಿಮಗೆ ಶ್ರೀಲಂಕಾ ಬಗ್ಗೆ ಒಂದು ಎಕ್ಸಾಂಪಲ್ ಇದೆ. ಐ ಜಸ್ಟ್ ಗಿವ್ ಯು ಅನ್ ಎಕ್ಸಾಂಪಲ್ ಆಫ್ ಶ್ರೀಲಂಕಾ. ಓಕೆ, ಶ್ರೀಲಂಕಾದಲ್ಲಿ ಸಿವಿಲ್ ವಾರ್ ಆಗುತ್ತಲ್ವಾ? ದ ನಾರ್ದನ್ ಪಾರ್ಟ್ ಆಫ್ ಶ್ರೀಲಂಕಾ, ದ ಜಾಫ್ನಾ ಪೆನಿನ್ಸುಲಾ, is where the Tamils are there. So they fought with the Sinhalese of Sri Lanka. They were Buddhist Sinhalese. Yaki civil war agid gotta? It is because these Tamils were not given any power. Centralization of power. So too much centralization can also lead to breakaway forces. Okay, anyway, we'll see it later. ಈಗಲೇ ಅಷ್ಟೊಂದು ತಲೆ ಕೆಡಿಸ್ಕೊಳ್ಳೋ ಅವಶ್ಯಕತೆ ಇಲ್ಲ. ಓಕೆ, ಸೊ 1833 is when, who is there in Bengal? Governor General of Bengal. Governor of Bengal became Governor General of Bengal. Now, for the first time, the Governor General of Bengal is being promoted or being designated as the Governor General of India. Who is that person? First, it was Warren Hastings. ಎರಡು ಹೆಸರು ನೀವು ನೆನಪು ಇಟ್ಕೋಬೇಕು. Warren Hastings is Governor General, first Governor General of Bengal. First Governor General of India is William Bentinck. It is just not this. It is just not designation. Governor General of Bengal became Governor General of India, who could now control Bombay and Madras. They lost their legislative powers. Andre, ನೀವು ಹೇಳ್ತಿದ್ದೀರಲ್ವಾ, ಇಟ್ ಈಸ್ ಲೈಕ್ ಪ್ರೈಮ್ ಮಿನಿಸ್ಟರ್ ಇಸ್ ಗೆಟಿಂಗ್ ಆಲ್ ದ ಪವರ್, ಚೀಫ್ ಮಿನಿಸ್ಟರ್ಸ್ಗೇನು ಲೆಜಿಸ್ಲೇಟಿವ್ ಪವರ್ ಇಲ್ಲ. ಅರ್ಥ ಆಗ್ತಿದ್ಯಾ? ಈವನ್ ಟುಡೇ you see there is a governor, he is appointed by central government. Most of the cases he will be supporting the central government only. It is a centralizing tendency. So ee tara this person, William Bentinck, or the Governor General of India, could control Bombay and Madras. Control annadkinta the laws which they were making independently in the each provinces, now it had to be done by the Governor General of India. They lost their legislative powers. Are you understanding? I'll just give you one example. ನಿಮಗೆ ಹಿಸ್ಟ್ರಿ ನೀವು ಓದಬೇಕಿದ್ರೆ ಆಂಗ್ಲೋ ಮರಾಠ ವಾರ್ಸ್ ಓದ್ತೀರಾ. ಆ ಫಸ್ಟ್ ಆಂಗ್ಲೋ ಮರಾಠ ವಾರ್ ನೀವು ನೋಡಿದ್ರೆ ಇಟ್ಸ್ ಅ ಫ್ಯಾಮಿಲಿ ಡಿಸ್ಪ್ಯೂಟ್. ಅಲ್ಲಿ ರಘುನಾಥ್ ರಾವ್ ಅಂತ ಇರ್ತಾನೆ, ನಾನಾ ಫಡ್ನವಿಸ್ ಅಂತ, there will be two people. When British Bombay Council was fighting with them, Calcutta Council opposed it. ಬ್ರಿಟಿಷ್ ಈಸ್ಟ್ ಇಂಡಿಯಾ ಕಂಪನಿ ಅಂತ ಏನಿತ್ತಲ್ವ ಇಂಡಿಯಾದಲ್ಲಿ 1780s ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಯುದ್ಧ ನಡಿಬೇಕಿದ್ರೆ ಬಾಂಬೆಯಲ್ಲಿ, ಪುಣೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಈ ಯುದ್ಧ ನಡಿಬೇಕಿದ್ರೆ ಬಾಂಬೆ ಪ್ರೆಸಿಡೆನ್ಸಿ ಫಾಟ್ ದ ಬ್ಯಾಟಲ್. ನೋ, ದಿಸ್ ವಾಸ್ ಅಪೋಸ್ಡ್ ಬೈ ಕಲ್ಕತ್ತಾ ಕೌನ್ಸಿಲ್. ಕ್ಲಿಯರ್ ಎಕ್ಸಾಂಪಲ್ ಆಫ್ ಅ ಡಿಸೆಂಟ್ರಲೈಸೇಷನ್ ಇದು. ದೇ ಫೆಲ್ಟ್ ದಟ್ ಈ ಡಿಸಿಷನ್ ತಪ್ಪು, ನಮ್ಮ ದುಡ್ಡು ವೇಸ್ಟ್ ಆಗುತ್ತೆ, ನಾವು ಯಾಕೆ ಇನ್ನೊಬ್ರು ಪೊಲಿಟಿಕಲ್ ಅಫೇರ್ಸ್? ಇಟ್ ವಾಸ್ ಅ ಒಪಿನಿಯನ್ ಆಫ್ ಕಲ್ಕತ್ತಾ. ಸೊ ವಾಟ್ ಈಸ್ ದಿಸ್? ಅ ಡಿಸೆಂಟ್ರಲೈಸ್ಡ್ ಸ್ಟ್ರಕ್ಚರ್. ಬಟ್ ವಾಟ್ ಚೇಂಜ್ಡ್? ಥ್ರೂ ಅಪಾಯಿಂಟಿಂಗ್ ಒನ್ ಗವರ್ನರ್ ಜನರಲ್ ಫಾರ್ ಎಂಟೈರ್ ಇಂಡಿಯಾ. And it also mentioned that from now on, which are the laws that we make will be called as acts. ಇಲ್ಲಿವರೆಗೂ ನೀವೇನು ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಂಬಂದಿದ್ದೀರಾ, ವಿ ವಿಲ್ ಕಾಲ್ ಇಟ್ ಆಸ್ ರೆಗ್ಯುಲೇಷನ್ಸ್. ಅಂದರೆ ಅದೇನು ಲೆಕ್ಕಕ್ಕಿಲ್ಲ, ಅಸಲಿ ಆಟ ಇವಾಗಿಂದ ಶುರು ಅಂತ ಇಸ್ ವಾಟ್ ದರ್ ಇಂಡೈರೆಕ್ಟ್ಲಿ ಟೆಲಿಂಗ್. ಸೊ 1833 ಆ್ಯಕ್ಟ್ ಸೆಂಟ್ರಲೈಸ್ಡ್ ಅಡ್ಮಿನಿಸ್ಟ್ರೇಷನ್ ಇನ್ ಇಂಡಿಯಾ. Pitt's India Act mentioned that these are British possessions. Now these people are telling that East India, and they lost monopoly of trade with China also. And ಅದರ ಅರ್ಥ ಏನು? ಇವ್ರ ಟ್ರೇಡಿಂಗ್ ಆಕ್ಟಿವಿಟೀಸ್ ಮುಗೀತು ಅಂತ. ಅಪಾರ್ಟ್ ಫ್ರಮ್ ಅಪಾಯಿಂಟಿಂಗ್ ಹಿಮ್ ಆಸ್ ದ ಗವರ್ನರ್ ಜನರಲ್ ಆಫ್ ಇಂಡಿಯಾ, ದೇ ಆಲ್ಸೋ ಅಬಾಲಿಷ್ಡ್ monopoly of trade with China that was there. With respect to tea, there is some confusion. We'll not talk about it at all. But we know that after Charter of Act of 1833, centralization ಮಾಡಿದ್ರು, and they converted this East India Company as a pure administrative body. ಆಯ್ತಾ? Pitt's India Act ಅಲ್ಲಿ possessions were called as British possessions, territories were called as British possessions. Now, ಇನ್ನೊಂದು ಹೆಜ್ಜೆ ಮುಂದಕ್ಕೆ ಹೋಗಿ, they are saying that these territories will be held under the trust of his heirs and successors of the Majesty, the Queen and the Kings of England. ಅರ್ಥ ಆಗ್ತಿದೆಯಾ? ಸೊ ಒಂಥರ ಅಡ ಇಡೋದು ಅಂತಾರಲ್ಲ, ಏನೋ ಗಿವಿಂಗ್ ಅಪ್ ದ ಸಾವರ್ನಿಟಿ ಇಸ್ ಥ್ರೂ ದ ಆಕ್ಟ್ ಆಫ್ 1833. They also tried to introduce an open competitive system. ಇದೆಲ್ಲ ನಿಮ್ಗೆ ಪ್ರಿಲಿಮ್ಸ್ ಅಲ್ಲಿ ಬರ್ತಿರುತ್ತೆ. Through which act it was tried to, but it failed because the court of directors opposed it, saying that the natives are not fit for bureaucracy ಅಂತ. ಓಪನ್ ಕಾಂಪಿಟೇಷನ್ ಅಂದರೆ ಎಲ್ಲರೂ ಎಕ್ಸಾಮ್ ಬರೆದು ಇವಾಗ ನಮ್ಗೆ ಹೆಂಗೆ KPSC UPSC ಎಲ್ಲ ಇದೆ, ಲೈಕ್ ದಟ್ they tried to introduce, but it was opposed and it failed. Okay, Charter Act of 1833. Online students following? All the 12 or 13 students who are there. Only Samarin and Bhumika have replied. ನೆಕ್ಸ್ಟ್ ಎಲ್ಲಿ ಬರೀತೀರಾ? ಇನ್ನೂ ಕ್ಲಾಸ್ ಮುಗ್ದಿಲ್ಲ. Charter Act of 1833. What is the first point? Governor General of Bengal was designated as Governor General of India. Who is that? Bracket ಅಲ್ಲಿ ವಿಲಿಯಂ ಬೆಂಟಿಕ್. ಕರೆಕ್ಟ್ ಅಲ್ವಾ? ವಿಲಿಯಂ ಬೆಂಟಿಕ್. ಒಂದೇ ಒಂದು ವರ್ಡಲ್ಲಿ ಬೇಕು ಅಂದರೆ ಬಿಗಿನಿಂಗ್ ಆಫ್ ಸೆಂಟ್ರಲೈಸೇಷನ್. Next point, lost monopoly trade with China. Lost monopoly trade with China. Lost monopoly trade with China. Did Bombay and Madras get legislative powers? No. Write down, Bombay and Madras lost legislative powers. So we'll finish the chapter and then we'll end the class today. On the 5-10 minutes extra, don't worry. Bombay and Madras lost legislative powers, which now was under the Governor General of India. Earlier laws were called, next point, earlier laws were called what? Regulations. And the laws made now were called as acts. Next point, British territories or British Indian territories from now on were held. Hi Vikas Gowda. Were held online ನೀವಲ್ಲ. ಈ ಕೋವಿಡ್ ಬಂದಮೇಲೆ ತುಂಬ ಆನ್ಲೈನ್ ಏನೋ ಕ್ಲಾಸಸ್ ಎಲ್ಲ ಜಾಸ್ತಿ ಆಗೋಗಿದೆ. ಏನಂತ ಬರೆದ್ರಿ? ಸಾರಿ, ಫ್ರಮ್ ನೌ ಆನ್ ದ ಬ್ರಿಟಿಷ್ ಟೆರಿಟರೀಸ್ ವೇರ್ ಹೆಲ್ಡ್ ಬೈ ಯಾರು ಬ್ರಾಕೆಟಲ್ಲಿ ಇನ್ ಟ್ರಸ್ಟ್ ಆಫ್ ಹಿಸ್ ಮೆಜೆಸ್ಟಿ his heirs ಅಂದರೆ ಮಕ್ಕಳು ಅಂತ. ಓಕೆ, HEIRS and successors. Last point, did you write that it lost monopoly of trade with China? ಅಲ್ಲೇ ಜಾಗ ಇದ್ರೆ from now on it became purely administrative body. ಇಲ್ಲಾಂದ್ರೆ ನೆಕ್ಸ್ಟ್ ಪಾಯಿಂಟ್ ಅಲ್ಲ ಬರ್ಕೋಬಹುದು. From now it became purely administrative body. ಆಯ್ತಾ? Last point, I'm sorry, tried to introduce open competition for appointment of civil servants. But was opposed by ಯಾರು? Yes, the court of directors. Opposed by the court of directors. ಆಯ್ತಾ? The last act is, ನಾನು ಯಾಕೆ ಇದನ್ನು ಓಪನ್ ಮಾಡಿದೆ ಅಂದರೆ, so you remember this, in the regulating act the governor general had what? ಯಾರವರು? The executive council. So you remember it, no? So the last act, the Charter Act of 1853, 20 years alva. The renewal is again for 20 years. So all of you now look at the board. The Charter Act of 1853 now introduced a legislative council. ಯಾರಿಗೆ? The governor general who is there will now have a executive council, will now have a legislative council. There were 6 members who were introduced to the legislative council. That does not mean they were elected. Basically ಏನು ಮಾಡ್ತಾರೆ ಇವರು? All the laws that were created will be suggested by them to the governor general and he will implement it through the executive council. Modern day institution, we have a parliament now, which is the legislative council. Who are the executives? The bureaucrats. The ministers are the executives. ಅದೇ ತರ ಅರ್ಥ ಆಗ್ತಿದೆಯಾ? So the governor general now had a legislative council with 6 members. But very important of this is, there were reservations here. Out of the 6, 4 were appointed through the local presidencies of Bombay, Bengal, Madras and ಇದೆಲ್ಲರಿಗೂ ಗೊತ್ತು, and Agra. Okay, so from these 4 local councils, out of 6, 4 were appointed by these 4 councils in the legislative council. So for the first time, some sort of Indian representation in the legislative body. Okay, so this later came to be known as the Indian Legislative Council. This developed into a Indian Legislative Council. So Charter Act of 1833 tried to introduce what? 18 ನಾನು ಹೇಳಿ ಕೇಳಿಸ್ತೀನಿ ನನಗೆ 1833 ಇದು ಮುಗೀತು ಬಿಡಿ ಫಸ್ಟ್ ಪಾಯಿಂಟ್. It tried to introduce what? Which was opposed by Court of Directors. Open competition for civil services, for civil servant. It failed because it was opposed by the Court of Directors. Was now a committee that was created, which we call it as the Macaulay Committee, which recommended for the introduction of open competition for civil servants in India through the Charter Act of 1853. Okay, na? So a civil services was reformed here through opening up for the open competition for Indians. So this opened up the administrative doors as well. And the most catchy aspect is the Charter Act of 1853 did not mention 20 years. So 1793, 1813, 1833 ಎಲ್ಲ ಕಡೆ ಏನಂತಿದ್ರು ನೆಕ್ಸ್ಟ್ 20 years ವರೆಗೂ ನೀವು ಕಂಟಿನ್ಯೂ ಮಾಡ್ಬೋದು ಅಂತ ಅಂದ್ರೆ ಆ ಥರ ನೋ ಟೈಮ್ ಲೈನ್ ವಾಸ್ ಮೆನ್ಷನ್ಡ್ ಇನ್ ದಿಸ್ ಆ್ಯಕ್ಟ್, ವಿಚ್ ಮೀನ್ಸ್ ಅಟ್ ಎನಿ ಪಾಯಿಂಟ್ ಆಫ್ ಟೈಮ್ ಯು ಆರ್ ಗೋಯಿಂಗ್ ಟು ಬಿ ಅಬಾಲಿಷ್ಡ್ ಇಸ್ ವಾಟ್ ದೆ ಮೀನ್. ಸಣ್ಣ ಪಾಯಿಂಟ್ಸಲ್ಲಿ ಬರ್ಕೊಂಬಿಡಿ, ನಾನು ಜಾಸ್ತಿ ಡಿಕ್ಟೇಟ್ ಮಾಡ್ತೀನಿ ಅಂತ ಅನ್ನಿಸ್ತಿದೆ. ಚಾರ್ಟರ್ ಆಕ್ಟ್ ಇಟ್ಸ್ ಸಾಕಲ್ವಾ? ಚಾರ್ಟರ್ ಆಕ್ಟ್ ಆಫ್ 1853. Charter Act 1853. Okay, first point. Write down. The Legislative Council was created for the Governor General. Adaralli, it introduced, for the next point, it introduced local representation. It introduced local representation in the Indian Legislative Council of the six legislative members. Of the six legislative members, 4 were appointed by the local governments of ಯಾವುದು ಬಾಂಬೆ, ಬೆಂಗಾಲ್, ಮಡ್ರಾಸ್ ಅಂಡ್ ಆಗ್ರಾ. ಆಯ್ತಾ? So now one more important event is happening in India's history. So East India Company chapter almost ಮುಗೀತು ಇವಾಗ. Why? 1853 ಆದ್ಮೇಲೆ ಏನಾಯ್ತು ಇಂಡಿಯಾದಲ್ಲಿ? Yes, very good. 1857. See, 1757, Battle of Plassey. 100 years after this is 1857, is Revolt of 1857. 90 years after this is India's independence. ಈ 7 ಅಲ್ಲಿ, it's a good number. 7, Tala for a reason. Yesterday, his birthday was there, people were making fun. Anyway, so, you see this, War of Independence, you call it. You call it as Revolt of 1857. It took a kind of a all India nature against East India Company from Delhi to Central India to, Jhansi. You know what all happened here. The British East India Company faced the stiffest opposition in India. This is when the revolt, the revolt of 1857 that happened. Obviously, the British were successful in defeating the local rulers. After the defeat, the East India Company was gone forever. It was abolished. Why? Because in 1858, a new act was introduced in the British Parliament known as the Act for Good Governance in India. The Act for Good Government in India, under which, okay, we will look at this act. So this is 1858. 1858 you have to remember, still revolt is going on. 1857 start ಆಗುತ್ತಲ್ಲ, 1.5 ವರ್ಷ ಆಗುತ್ತೆ ಮುಗಿಯೋಕ್ಕೆ. The revolt is going on, but they are suppressing everyone, there is no doubt. Jhansi Rani, Lakshmi Bai, and the Eddu Tantia Tope, all of them fought, right? They lost it. They sacrificed their lives. This is going on, but they introduced a law in British Parliament known as the Act for Good Government in India. What is the first thing that they did? Abolishing the East India Company and declaring that India would be now ruled by the Queen. So, India now officially, so if someone is asking you a question, from when did British rule in India? It is from 1858, officially. From 1765 to 1857, it was the rule of, yes, it was a company rule. Now it is the British Raj, we call it as the British Raj. Company rule is from 17, according to me, 57. 17 ಅಂದರೆ ಬ್ಯಾಟಲ್ ಆಫ್ ಪ್ಲಾಸಿನ ಸೋಲ್ಸಿದಾಗಿಂದ ಬೆಂಗಾಲ್ನ ರೂಲ್ ಮಾಡೋಕ್ಕೆ ಸ್ಟಾರ್ಟ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ರು. ಅಲ್ಲಿಂದ 1857 ವರೆಗೂ ಇಟ್ ವಾಸ್ ದ ರೂಲ್ ಆಫ್ ದ ಕಂಪನಿ. ಫ್ರಮ್ 1857 to 1947 it was the rule of the British Raj, or the British Crown ruling over India. So it was officially declared that we are going to ban this East India Company and we will be ruling this country under the British Crown. The Governor General of India and the designation ittu, it became Viceroy. Who was the first Viceroy? Very good. Lord Canning became the first Viceroy. What about Board of Control? What about Court of Directors? What about them? Board of Control and Court of Directors was abolished, but a new office was created called as a Secretary of the State. Who was the secretary? This secretary was a member of the British Cabinet. Cabinet and the ministry. There is a ministry, no? There is a prime minister. There is a. Yesterday we spoke about, parliamentary democracy. So there is a council of ministers. Otherly, most important ministers are cabinet ministers. So this secretary of the state had to be a member of this cabinet. Okay, this secretary of the state was now assisted by a 15-member council. So secretary of the state along with these 15 members was the secretary general or the secretary council that was existing in India. So Viceroy is the new Governor General is now designated as Viceroy, and there is a Secretary of a State. Secretary of a State is assisted by a 15-member council. After abolishing all, Board of Control and Court of Directors. Okay, so from now on, it is, November 1st, 1858, it was declared that from now on, we will be, or the British Crown will be taking over India. Aita? So write down. Aftermath of, or after revolt of 1857. Nice. Write down. The revolt of 1857. The revolt of 1857. / Sepoy Mutiny. Sepoy Mutiny. ಅಂದರೆ ಆರ್ ಸಿಪಾಯಿ ಮ್ಯೂಟಿನಿ ಆರ್ ಇನ್ನೊಂದು ದ ಫಸ್ಟ್ ವಾರ್ ಆಫ್ ಇಂಡಿಪೆಂಡೆನ್ಸ್ led to Government of India Act 1858. Led to Government of India Act 1858. It was called Act for Good Government in India. Act for Good Government in India. It abolished the East India Company. India, next point, or fine, no problem. India hence was ruled by ಯಾರು? Her Majesty or the Queen, whatever. ಆಯ್ತಾ? The designation of Governor General of India was changed to Viceroy. ಯಾರದು? Lord Canning. It abolished Board of Control and Court of Directors. Next, the office of Secretary of the State. It created office of Secretary of the State, and also a 15-member council, to assist the Secretary of the State. ಆಯ್ತಾ? The Secretary was a member of the British Cabinet, alva? A member of the British Cabinet. Next point. This was seen as only a administrative change. So hi Dikshit, Vikas, Samran, Bhumika, hi all of you. Aita? So from now on it is the British government that is going to rule India directly from 1858. Aita? So after the Government of India Act 1858, there were 3 Councils Act that were introduced. The first such act was the Indian Councils Act of 1861, within 3 years of the rule. See, ಏನಾಗ್ತಿದೆ ನೋಡಿ, in the country which started from 1757 until 1857, there are numerous issues. For example, you take Mysore itself. When Tipu Sultan was fighting with the British, who supported Tipu Sultan? No one. Who supported the British? Nizams or Obrana? Marathas. Then one more. ಇದು ಮೈಸೂರು ಅಲ್ವಾ? ಮೈಸೂರಿಂದ ಸೌತ್ ಹೋದರೆ ಏನಿದೆ? ಕೇರಳ. ಸೌತ್ ಈಸ್ಟ್ ಹೋದರೆ ತಮಿಳ್ನಾಡು. ನಾರ್ತ್ ಈಸ್ಟ್ ಹೋದರೆ ಹೈದರಾಬಾದ್, ಅಂದರೆ ನಿಜಾಮ್ಸ್. ನಾರ್ತ್ ವೆಸ್ಟ್ ಹೋದರೆ ಮರಾಠಾಸ್. ಈ ಕಡೆ ತಮಿಳ್ನಾಡಲ್ಲಿ ಯಾರಿದ್ರು? ಬ್ರಿಟಿಷ್ ಅವರೇ ಇದ್ದರು. ಮಡ್ರಾಸ್. ಸೌತಲ್ಲಿ ಟ್ರಾವೆನ್ಕೋರ್ ಕಿಂಗ್ಡಮ್, ಮರಾಠಾಸ್, ದ ನಿಜಾಮ್ಸ್. ಎವ್ರಿ ಒನ್ ಅಟ್ಯಾಕ್ಟ್ ಹಿಮ್ ಅಂದರೆ ಮೈಸೂರು ಕಿಂಗ್ಡಮ್. So what I'm trying to say here is, if you simply centralize like in 1833 Act, ಇವರೆಲ್ಲ ಯಾಕೆ ಸಪೋರ್ಟ್ ಮಾಡ್ತಿದ್ದಾರೆ ಬ್ರಿಟಿಷ್ಗೆ? They want some political, they have some political ambitions, they have some jealousy. Why Marathas are supporting? They want more territories north of Tungabhadra river. The Marath, if you go even today, Belgaum or Bagalkot, Hubli, Dharwad, what do we call it as? Bombay, Karnataka. Bidar, Raichur, Gangavati, Ballari, they are called as Hyderabad, Karnataka. It is there until today. Why? It is because of the same thing that happened. This region was ruled by Hyderabad Nizams. This area was ruled by the Marathas. Later, the British ruled it. That's a different thing. Because of this only we call it even today, no? So, no area, even the British knew. ನಾವು ಹಿಂಗೆ ಸೆಂಟ್ರಲೈಸ್ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಂಡು ಕೂತ್ಕೊಂಡ್ರೆ ರಿವೋಲ್ಟ್ ಆಫ್ 1857 ಆಗಿದೆ, ನಾಳೆ ಇನ್ನೊಂದೇನಾದ್ರು ಆಗುತ್ತೆ ಅಂತ ಅಂದರೆ ಆಗ್ಬೋದು. ದಟ್ ಈಸ್ ವೆನ್ ದೇ ಥಾಟ್ ದಟ್ ವಿ ಶುಡ್ ಗಿವ್ ಬ್ಯಾಕ್ ದ ಪವರ್ಸ್ ಟು ದೆಮ್. ಬಟ್ ನಾಟ್ ಆಲ್ ಪವರ್ಸ್, ದೇ ಡಿ ನಾಟ್ ಗಿವ್ ಆಲ್ ಪವರ್ಸ್. ದೇ ಟ್ರೈಡ್ ಟು ಮೇಕ್ ಶ್ಯೂರ್ ದಟ್ ಪೀಪಲ್ ಫೀಲ್ ದಟ್ ದೇ ಆರ್ ರೆಪ್ರೆಸೆಂಟೆಡ್. ಸೊ ಆ ಥರ ಒಂದು ಆ್ಯಕ್ಟೇ ಇಸ್ ದ ಇಂಡಿಯನ್ ಕೌನ್ಸಿಲ್ಸ್ ಆ್ಯಕ್ಟ್ 1861. ಆಯಿತಾ? ನಾನು ಯಾಕೆ ಇದನ್ನೆಲ್ಲ ಎಕ್ಸ್ಪ್ಲನೇಷನ್ ಕೊಡ್ತಿದ್ದೀನಿ ಅಂತಂದರೆ, ನೀವು ಅಟ್ಲೀಸ್ಟ್ ನಾಳೆ ದಿನ ಮರ್ತೋದ್ರೂ ಪ್ರಿಲಿಮ್ಸಲ್ಲಿ ಸೆಂಟೆನ್ಸ್ ಬಂದರೆ ಗೆಸ್ ಮಾಡಲಿ ಅಂತ ಅಷ್ಟೆ. 1833 1857 ಆಗೋವರೆಗೂ ಇವರು ಡಿಸೆಂಟ್ರಲೈಸ್ ಮಾಡಲ್ಲ, ಯಾಕೆಂದ್ರೆ ಅವ್ರ ಹತ್ರ ಅಧಿಕಾರ ಇದೆ, ಎಲ್ಲರೂ ಅವ್ರು ಹೇಳ್ದಂಗೆ ಕೇಳ್ತಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಬಟ್ 1857 ಏನಾಯಿತು? ಯುದ್ಧ ನಡೀತು. ಅವ್ರಿಗೆ ಗೊತ್ತಾಯ್ತು ಇವ್ರು ನಮ್ಮ ಮಾತು ಇನ್ನೂ ಕೇಳಲ್ಲ, ಸ್ವಲ್ಪ ಇವ್ರ ಪವರ್ಸ್ ವಾಪಸ್ ಕೊಡಬೇಕು ಅಂತ. ಅದಕ್ಕೆ ಏನು ಕ್ರಿಯೇಟ್ ಮಾಡಿದ್ರು? 3 ಕೌನ್ಸಿಲ್ಸ್ ಆ್ಯಕ್ಟ್ ವರ್ ಗಿವನ್. ಫಸ್ಟ್ ಒನ್ ಇಸ್ ಇಂಡಿಯನ್ ಕೌನ್ಸಿಲ್ಸ್ ಆ್ಯಕ್ಟ್ ಆಫ್ 1861. So what happened here? The legislative council that was existing earlier, if you remember, was now had representations of Indians directly, but they were considered to be non-official members. ಏನಇದರ ಅರ್ಥ ಅಂದರೆ, in the legislative council that was created now, there were official members and non-official members. These official members had voting rights, non-official members had no voting rights. ಇವತ್ತು ನೀವು ನಮ್ಮ ಪಾರ್ಲಿಮೆಂಟಲ್ಲಿ ಯಾವುದೋ ಒಂದು ಲಾ ಪಾಸ್ ಮಾಡಬೇಕಂತ ಅನ್ಕೊಳ್ಳೋಣ. ಇಫ್ ಯು ವಾಂಟ್ ಟು ಪಾಸ್ ಅ ಲಾ, ದ MPs ಶುಡ್ ವೋಟ್, ರೈಟ್? ಇಮ್ಯಾಜಿನ್ ಅ ಪಾರ್ಲಿಮೆಂಟ್ ವಿತ್ 2 kinds of MPs. One MP can vote, one cannot vote. This is such a kind of procedure. Indian Legislative Council was expanded. Non-official members were introduced. All of them were Indians, but with no power. Okay. 1833 Act, which took away the legislative powers. Now, through the Indian Councils Act, they tried to decentralize and the legislative powers were given back to Bombay. What about Madras and Bengal? In Madras and Bengal, provincial legislative councils were created. ಅಂದರೆ ಇವತ್ತು ನಮಗಿದೆ ಅಲ್ವಾ ಸ್ಟೇಟ್ ಲೆಜಿಸ್ಲೇಟಿವ್ ಅಸೆಂಬ್ಲಿ, ಪಾರ್ಲಿಮೆಂಟ್. ಡೋಂಟ್ ಯು ಥಿಂಕ್ ಇಟ್ಸ್ ಡೈರೆಕ್ಟ್ ಎವಲ್ಯೂಷನ್ ಆಫ್ ಇಟ್? ಇಲ್ಲಿಂದ ಸ್ಟಾರ್ಟ್ ಆಗ್ತಿದೆ ಇದೆಲ್ಲ. ಐ ಯು ಅಂಡರ್ಸ್ಟ್ಯಾಂಡಿಂಗ್? ಸೊ ಜಸ್ಟ್ ಇಮ್ಯಾಜಿನ್, ನೀವು ಹಿಸ್ಟ್ರಿ ಓದಿದ್ರೆ ನಿಮಗೆ ಗೊತ್ತಾಗುತ್ತೆ. ಆ್ಯಂಡ್ ದಿಸ್ ಸೆಂಟೆನ್ಸ್ ಡೋಂಟ್ ಟೇಕ್ ಇಟ್ ವೆರಿ ಸೀರಿಯಸ್ಲಿ. ಸಮ್ಟೈಮ್ಸ್ ಐ ಫೀಲ್ ಬ್ರಿಟಿಷ್ ರೂಲಿಂಗ್ ಇಂಡಿಯಾ ಇಸ್ ಗುಡ್. ಯಾವ ರೀತಿ ಅಂತಂದರೆ, ಯು ಲುಕ್ ಅಟ್ ಇಂಡಿಯನ್ ಸೊಸೈಟಿ ಬಿಫೋರ್ ದ ಬ್ರಿಟಿಷ್ ಕೇಮ್. ಪೀಪಲ್ ಹ್ಯಾಡ್ ಸೋ ಮಚ್ ಆಫ್ ಡಿಫರೆನ್ಸಸ್, ಕ್ಯಾಸ್ಟ್ ಹೈರಾರ್ಕೀಸ್, ಡಾಮಿನೇಷನ್ ಆಫ್ ಅ ಫ್ಯೂ, ಇದೆಲ್ಲ ಇತ್ತು. ಬಟ್ ಇಮ್ಯಾಜಿನ್ ಇಫ್ ದ ಬ್ರಿಟಿಷ್ ಲಾಸ್ಟ್, ವೆನ್ ಟಿಪ್ಪು ಸುಲ್ತಾನ್ ವಾಸ್ ಫೈಟಿಂಗ್ ಅಗೇನ್ಸ್ಟ್ ದ ಬ್ರಿಟಿಷ್, he had contacted Napoleon, the French ruler. He had contacted the Muslim rulers, Zaman Shah of Persia. They had planned to invade India and defeat British and take the territories with them. So in a way, if you are looking at these acts where British started to rule and they controlled this entire territory, in a way they are giving powers ononde. Something is better than nothing andange. This is turned out to be good anta helಬೋದು. Or else, do you think India would have been a united force? Yes, there is Bharata, 100%, I don't deny the fact. But just imagine, if these things were not there, do you think whatever the constitution that we have, the administrative setup we have in such a vast, diverse country, we could have devised it so easily after 1947? No. ನಾವು 1947 ಆದಮೇಲೆ ಏನಕ್ಕೆ ಇಷ್ಟು ಈಸಿಯಾಗಿ ಮಾಡ್ತಿದ್ದೀವಿ ಅಂತಂದರೆ, ಬಿಕಾಸ್ ಇಂಡಿಯನ್ಸ್ ವರ್ ಆಲ್ರೆಡಿ ಇನ್ವಾಲ್ವ್ಡ್. ಇಂಡಿಯನ್ಸ್ ಅಂದರೆ ಇಂಡಿಯನ್ ನ್ಯಾಷನಲ್ ಕಾಂಗ್ರೆಸ್ ಪೀಪಲ್ were already involved in the administration, they just continued it. Okay, so this is just my opinion. You look at this act also, 1861. It is giving away the legislative powers to Bombay and creating provincial legislative councils in Bengal, in northwestern frontier province. Elli gotta idu northwest frontier province andre Pakistan Afghanistan border. Pakistan was India only, no? Correct, right? So Pakistan has Sindh, Balochistan, Punjab and northwest frontier. It shares border with Afghanistan. Those provinces, were all given local, provincial, legislative assemblies, which gradually led to setting up of provincial assemblies later to all constituencies. But it started in Indian Councils Act 1861. And for the first time, there was something that was introduced called as the portfolio system. Isn't it existing today? What portfolio do you have? Finance. What portfolio do you have? Transport, a transport ministry, industries ministry. So the portfolio system was introduced by Lord Canning for the first time in the Indian Councils Act of 1861. Artha agtidya? So this is, and moreover, and one more thing I forgot to tell you, I'm sorry. The Viceroy was empowered to pass the laws without the consent of Legislative Council during emergency. So emergency provision we see in our constitution today, that was introduced in Indian Councils Act of 1861 also. Indian Councils Act 1861. Indian Councils Act 1860. The centralizing tendency, which was introduced in 1833. You remember, no? Provisions of Charter Act 1833. You remember, Governor General became Governor General of India. Bombay and Madras lost legislative powers. I told you, centralizing. So write down the centralizing tendency, which began in 1833. Was now decentralized. For the first time, Indians were appointed in the Legislative Council as non-official members. Next point. Legislative powers were given back to the provinces and the work company. It introduced what system? It introduced portfolio system. Bracket introduced by Lord Canning anta ಬರ್ಕೋಬಹುದು. ಆಯ್ತಾ? Next, it also introduced emergency provisions. The emergency provisions in which Viceroy ಮಾತಾಡಿ ಹೋಗಿ. ಗರ್ಲ್ಫ್ರೆಂಡಾ? ಇನ್ ವಿಚ್ ವೈಸ್ ರಾಯ್? ನಮಗೆಲ್ಲ ಯಾರು ಬೀಳ್ತಾರೆ ಸರ್ ಅಂತ ನಾವೆಲ್ಲ ಹಂಗೆ ಹೇಳ್ತಿದ್ವಿ. ಓಕೆ, ಎನಿವೆ, ಇನ್ ವಿಚ್ ದ ವೈಸ್ ರಾಯ್ could issue ordinances without the concurrence of ordinance andre laws. Could issue ordinances without the concurrence of the legislative council. Without the concurrence of the legislative council. ಆಯ್ತಾ? So I told you there were 3 acts. One was in 1861, now in 1892. So I am quoting historical events and telling you why it is happening. Now tell me one more important historical event that led to 1892 Councils Act. So revolt of 1857 ಆಯಿತು, I told you, which led to Indian Councils Act, through which they promised of giving some powers to Indians. What about 1892 Councils Act? Bega, we are nearing to 1947. Madam, ತಲೆನೋವ್ತಿದ್ಯಾ? ಕೇಳಿಸ್ಕೊಳ್ಳಿ, ವೆರಿ ವೆರಿ ಇಂಪಾರ್ಟೆಂಟ್. ಇನ್ನೊಂದು 2-3 ಅಷ್ಟೇ ಮುಗಿದಾಯ್ತು, 1947 ಬಂತು. What is an important historical event? ಗಾಂಧಿ ಮದುವೆ ಆಯ್ತಾ? What is it? Establishment of Indian National Congress in 1885. Okay, so what is happening? Indian National Congress that was established by a British officer, what's his name? Alexandria Octavium, AOUM, alva something. Okay. So this person created this political forum for fellow Indians in order to, see, some call it as a safety valve theory antare. The dissent that was happening in Indians, ivar mukhantra pressure nache hakana anta they created this. So they had done some works. So what was it? They are criticized for this. They did not take a revolutionary stand. They were on constitutional methods. They were through petitions, through parliamentary means. They were demanding for self-rule. They were demanding for Indians to be introduced in, initially self-rule kelilla avrenu. They were demanding for Indians to be introduced in the parliament alla, in the legislative councils, in administration. So this is the impact of the Indian Councils Act of 1892, where elections were held for the first time in India. The term election is not used. It was called as nomination, because all the people were not allowed to vote. It was only after 1947 we have, getting universal adult suffrage. So elections were introduced for the first time in the Indian Councils Act of 1891. Apart from this, Provincial Legislative Council set up ಆಯ್ತಲ್ವಾ 1861 ಅಲ್ಲಿ, and there is a Central Legislative Council of Viceroy. The numbers were increased. Why? The Indian National Congress were asking for this. And also there were provisions that were introduced for the non-official members to ask more questions about the budget. ಅರ್ಥ ಆಗ್ತಿದೆಯಾ? So it is some sort of powers were given to Indians. ಬೇಗ ಬರ್ಕೊಂಬಿಡ. Indian Councils Act 1891. First point, elections introduced for the first time. Elections introduced for the first time. Bracket alli the word nomination was used. The word nomination was used. Second point, increase the number of non-official members in both central and provincial legislative councils. Last point, what is it? They could ask more questions on budget. They could ask and discuss more questions on budget. Aita, yaru non-official members would ask questions on budget and question the executive. Aita, sorry, they could ask more questions on budget and the questions to the executive. Aita, do you think Indians are involved in the executive council? Legislative council avagina nodkondu bartideve. As non-official members, Indians are involved there. What about executive council? They're not there. We have not spoken about it. So, the Morley-Minto Reforms was introduced in 1909. Again, history. Why it was introduced? Tell me one more important event. Why? Very good. Partition of Bengal happened on the basis of religion. West Bengal had Hindus. ಇವತ್ತು ಎಲ್ಲ ಬಾಂಗ್ಲಾದೇಶದಿಂದ ಬಂದು ಸೇರ್ಕೊಂಡ್ಬಿಟ್ಟಿದ್ದಾರೆ. But on that day, West Bengal had a Hindu majority population. Muslims were there. Eastern Bengal was considered to be dominated by Muslims. It was to please the Muslims. ಯಾಕೆಂದರೆ ಈ ಟೈಮಲ್ಲಿ it is not just partition of Bengal, also creation of Muslim League was happening in Dhaka. ಇದೆಲ್ಲ ಇವೆಂಟ್ಸ್ ನಡೀತಿದೆ. ಇವರು ಗೊತ್ತಾಯಿತು, ಇನ್ನು ಮಕ್ಕಳನ್ನ ಇನ್ನೂ ಬಕ್ರಾ ಮಾಡಬೇಕು, ಇವ್ರನ್ನ ಇನ್ನೂ ಹೊಡಿಬೇಕು. It is when they divide Hindus and Muslims, only the British could rule India. Why? I'll give you one small example. When revolt of 1857 was happening, Jhansi Rani Lakshmi Bai led the revolt. She was supported by Muslim soldiers. For whom did she fight? She fought against the British to declare Muhammad Shah Zafar, the Mughal emperor, to be the emperor of India. This idea of communalism, idea of Hindu-Muslim divide was created by the British, especially by this person called as Minto, Lord Minto. So 1909 Councils Act is also called as Morley-Minto Reforms. Who is Morley? Morley is the secretary of the state. Minto is the viceroy. So mixed together we call it as Morley-Minto Reforms. What did it do? The good things. It increased the number of legislative members from 16 to 60. It was a good thing. For the first time, Indians were involved in the executive council. Who was that first person? Satyendra Prasad Sinha became the first member of the executive council. But what was the worst thing that was introduced here? It introduced separate electorates for Hindus, for Muslims. What do you mean by separate electorates? Muslims could only elect Muslims. Hindus will vote for the Hindu candidates. So, communalism was officialized in India. Communalism became an official thing in India through the Indian Councils Act of 1909, and Lord Minto is today known to be called as the father of communalism in India. He formalized it. So the events, ಇದನ್ನೆಲ್ಲ ನಾನು ಬರೆಸ್ತಿಲ್ಲ, ನೀವು ಜ್ಞಾಪಕ ಇಟ್ಕೋಬೇಕು. ಬಿಕಾಸ್ ಯು ರೀಡ್ ಹಿಸ್ಟ್ರಿ, ದಟ್ಸ್ ವೈ ಐ ಆಮ್ ನಾಟ್ ಮೇಕಿಂಗ್ ಯು ರೈಟ್. ನಿಮ್ಗೆ ಜ್ಞಾಪಕ ಇರಬೇಕು. ಅರ್ಥ ಆಗ್ತಿದೆ. ಸೊ Morley-Minto Reforms or the Councils Act of 1909, even though it has increased representation to Indians in Executive Council and Legislative Council, it communalized the Indian political setup. ಆಯ್ತಾ? Councils Act of 1909. Indian Councils Act 1909. Good. Samrin has answered. Bengal partition, yes. Councils Act of 1909. Also known as Morley-Minto Reforms. Also known as Morley-Minto Reforms. It increased the strength of Central Legislative Council, from 16 to 60. From 16 to 60. ಆಯ್ತಾ? ಗೊತ್ತಾಗ್ಲಿಲ್ವಾ? It increased the strength of Central Legislative Council from 16 to 60. For the first time, Satyendra Prasad Sinha, or an Indian, either Satyendra Prasad Sinha, was involved in the Executive Council. It introduced separate electorates for Muslims. Separate electorate for Muslims. The Muslim members were to be elected by Muslim voters. Thus, the act legalized communalism. ಆಯ್ತಾ? Lord Minto came to be known as father of communal electorate. Last point, it also provided representation for presidency corporations, zamindars, and universities. Zamindars and universities. For presidency corporations, zamindars and universities. ಆಯ್ತಾ? Can we continue until 10:30? Or ತಲೆ ತಿರುಗ್ತಿದೆಯಾ ಇನ್ನು? Or we'll continue tomorrow, no problem. We'll finish with the last provision and for today, and we'll continue tomorrow. Okay, no problem. What is the next thing that happened in 1919. ಏನು ಸರ್? ಹಾಂ, ಓಕೆ. What happened in 1919? So 3 council acts were passed. ಯಾವಾಗ 1861, 1891 or 92, then 1909. Okay. The next act that we have to talk about is the Government of India Act 1919. Don't write, we'll just discuss, we'll write tomorrow. Okay. So why this was introduced? Government historically when you ಹೇಳ್ತಿದ್ರಲ್ಲ ಹೇಳಿ ಇದೆಲ್ಲದಕ್ಕೂ you gave. So 1919 Government of India Act was passed. What is the historical event that is associated with 1919? Sorry? Okay. That might be one of the reason. But entry of Gandhi into the Indian political arena after 1915, because in 1917 only the British government declared that we will be having a responsible government in India. What do you mean by a responsible government? Responsible government andre answerable government. Yesterday we saw what is answerable, legislative answerable to him. That is what you mean by a responsible government. So for the first time in the Government of India Act 1919, provincial subjects and central subjects were divided. Today what we have? Union list, state list, concurrent list. Very similarly, provincial subjects, it was called as subjects, and the central subjects were divided. These provincial subjects were again divided into 2. Transferred subjects and reserved subjects. What do you mean by this? Artha aita? Now we have central list, state list. Avaga they have central subjects and provincial subject. Provincial subjects are divided into reserved and transferred subjects. What do you mean by reserved? Each provinces were headed by governors. Central you had a viceroy, you had governors in each state. These governors were also assisted by executive council, legislative council, like how viceroy is assisted. So the reserved subjects, the laws which were there in the reserved subjects, which it could be passed by the governor without the consent of the legislative council. Andre ನಮ್ಮ ಸ್ಟೇಟಲ್ಲಿ ಅಸೆಂಬ್ಲಿಯಲ್ಲಿ ಪಾಸ್ ಆಗದೇನೆ ಗವರ್ನರ್ ಡೈರೆಕ್ಟ್ ಸೈನ್ ಹಾಕ್ಬಿಟ್ಟು ಲಾ ಮಾಡ್ದಂಗೆ. These were reserved subjects. Transferred subjects, it was responsible, which means the legislative council of each provinces had to agree. Only then the governor could make laws. So this provision was called as diarchy, of dividing subjects into provincial and transferred and reserved subjects. For the first time, bicameralism was introduced in the Central Legislative Council. We have today Lok Sabha and Rajya Sabha. Very similarly, 2 houses were created. An upper house and a lower house was created in the Government of India Act 1919 itself. Okay, so it was for the first time it was introduced. The Central Public Service Commission, today we call it as Union Public Service Commission. This was introduced here. An idea of provincial budget, an idea of a union budget or a central budget was introduced in the Government of India Act 1919. So basically, the Government of India Act 1919 and the Government of India Act 1935 is a document that has modeled our current political setup. Aita, so anyway, we will discuss this tomorrow and we'll write it. Can you simply revise what all we have done today? Start, someone. Pushmita. We started with? So what are the events that? Explain. ಬಿಡಿ, ಎನಿವೇ ನಿಮಗೆ ಟೆಸ್ಟ್ ಇರುತ್ತಲ್ವಾ, ನಾನು ಇಲ್ಲಿ ಕ್ವಶನ್ಸ್ ಕೇಳಕ್ಕೆ ಹೋಗಲ್ಲ. ವಿಲ್ ಸಿ ಹೌ ಯು ಪರ್ಫಾರ್ಮ್ ದ ಟೆಸ್ಟ್ ಓನ್ಲಿ ಡೈರೆಕ್ಟ್ಲಿ. ಓಕೆ, ಬಟ್ ಎನಿವೇ ಗೋ ಹೋಮ್ ಅಂಡ್ ರಿವೈಸ್ ಆರ್ ಎಲ್ಸ್ you will tend to forget. So tomorrow we will do Government of India Act 1919, Government of India Act 1935, Independence Act of 1947. After that we will start with ಮೇಕಿಂಗ್ ಆಫ್ ದ ಇಂಡಿಯನ್ ಕಾನ್ಸ್ಟಿಟ್ಯೂಷನ್. ನೆಕ್ಸ್ಟ್ ಅದರಲ್ಲಿ salient features of Indian Constitution. Then we'll start with preamble. ಈ ಥರ we will start with the Constitution. Okay, so tomorrow we'll try to finish these acts that are remaining and the making of Indian Constitution. ಆಯ್ತಾ? So we'll meet tomorrow. Bye. Thank you. Bye. Online students also. Thank you. Bye.